They told her this road was not for women. They told her it was too long, too wild, too deadly. So she walked it anyway. A single woman, 16 oxen, a wagon heavier than a house, and hundreds of miles of mountains. Fire, and lawless land between her and survival. No army, no protection, no second chance. She crossed burning forests while men ran the other way. She drove through mountain passes where one mistake meant death. She carried food to starving gold miners when entire towns had already given up. They would later call her the toughest woman in Australia. But that wasn't her name. Her name was Agnes Buntine, a poor immigrant girl who refused to die quietly. And this is the true story they never taught you in school. The night was unnaturally still. No wind pressed against the trees. No insects dared to sing. Even the forest seemed to be holding its breath. Agnes Buntine lay on a narrow wooden bed inside a weather-beaten hut at the edge of Gippsland. The walls were rough, scarred by decades of storms, smoke, and time. Every plank had a sound, every joint a memory. Tonight. They creaked softly, as if the house itself knew something was ending. Her breathing was slow now, deep, measured. Each rise of her chest carried the weight of years spent walking behind oxen, gripping leather reins, and staring down roads that had broken stronger men. Outside, the land she had crossed more times than anyone could count rested in darkness. Those roads were never meant to remember names. They swallowed footprints quickly. Rain erased them. Dust buried them. Fire burned them away. But if land could remember, this land would remember her. The mountain tracks where wagons slipped inches from death. The forests where smoke rolled faster than horses could run. The valleys where hunger waited for anyone who arrived too late. Agnes had walked them all. Now, she barely moved. Her hands, once thick and scarred, lay still at her sides. Those hands had tied yokes, cracked whips, dragged wheels from mud, and steadied frightened animals in storms so fierce they drowned out human thought. Tonight, they rested. There was no one in the room, no crowd, no ceremony, no applause, just a woman, a bed, and the quiet truth that a life built on endurance rarely ends loudly. Somewhere beyond the walls, a tree branch shifted. The sound was faint, almost imagined. It carried her backward. She did not think in words anymore. She thought in images. Morning frost clinging to oxen hides, the smell of eucalyptus crushed under boots, the low, rhythmic grunt of animals pulling weight that matched her own. She remembered walking, always walking, because drivers who sat were weak, and weak drivers lost control. She remembered how the ground felt through the soles of her boots, how she could sense danger before she could see it. A bad slope, a soft shoulder, a place where wagons tipped and men disappeared. She remembered fire, the heat pressing against her back, the sky turning the color of rust. The moment she chose which things to save and which to let burn. Most people never face moments like that. Most people never have to decide what part of their life survives and what must be sacrificed to keep moving forward. Agnes had made those decisions more than once. They would later give her names. They would call her brutal. They would call her fearless. They would call her unnatural. But in this room, none of that mattered. She was not a legend here. She was simply a woman who had done what needed to be done, over and over again, because stopping was never an option. Her story did not begin with strength. It began with poverty, with a narrow street in Glasgow, with cold floors and too many mouths to feed, with a girl who learned early that survival was not heroic, it was routine. That girl had crossed an ocean. She had buried children. She had watched a husband fade slowly into weakness. She had carried entire communities on wheels pulled by animals that trusted her more than men did. And now, at the far edge of the world, she helped carve open. The road finally stopped beneath her feet. The silence deepened. If someone had been listening closely, they might have heard something else beneath the quiet. Not fear, not regret, but acceptance. The kind that only comes to people who never waited for permission to live. Outside, Gippsland remained unchanged. It had taken her labor and given her nothing freely in return. That was the agreement they had shared. As the night moved on, the line between breath and memory blurred. And somewhere in that blur, the story began again. Not at the end, but at the beginning. Back to a girl with nothing. Back to a world that would test her. Back to the moment before anyone knew her name. Long before the roads learned her weight. Before oxen answered her voice. Before fire tested her will. Agnes was just a child in a city that had no mercy. Glasgow, 1822. The air there was thick with smoke and damp stone. Narrow streets pressed close together, trapping cold between their walls. The floors were always wet. The light never fully arrived. People learned early that comfort was a luxury reserved for others. Agnes Davidson was born into a house that already had too many mouths and too little food. Her father, John Davidson, worked the land where land could still be worked, though it gave almost nothing back. Her mother, Sarah, kept the household from collapsing through quiet discipline and constant motion. There were no soft days, no pauses. Life moved forward whether you were ready or not. Agnes learned that lesson early. She learned it when hunger became familiar, when cold stopped being shocking and became routine, when work was not assigned, it was assumed. There are no records of her childhood joys, no stories of toys or lessons or laughter preserved in writing. What remains instead are the shapes of survival. A girl fetching water before sunrise, small hands learning how to carry weight without complaint, a body growing strong not by choice, but by necessity. School was never guaranteed. Education, where it existed at all, was thin and brief. Girls like Agnes were not raised to imagine futures. They were raised to endure the present. The city around her was changing fast. Factories rose, crowds thickened. Glasgow swelled with laborers chasing wages that barely sustained them. Opportunity existed, but it was uneven, cruel, and fleeting for families like the Davidsons. The future was always one illness, one bad season, one lost job away from collapse. And then came the stories. Whispers at first, rumors carried by travelers, letters passed between hands like contraband hope. They spoke of a place on the other side of the world, a land so wide it frightened people who had never seen a horizon without walls, a place where work was brutal but possible, where land did not belong to centuries of history, but to whoever could survive it. Australia, for many. It was a fantasy, for others. A sentence, for the Davidsons. It became a gamble they could not afford not to take. Agnes was still a teenager when the decision was made. There was no dramatic announcement, no celebration, just quiet preparation. What little they owned was sorted, reduced, abandoned. Lives do not pack neatly when they are poor. You choose what might keep you alive and leave the rest behind. The ship waited at the edge of the known world. When it pulled away from the Scottish coast in 1839, the land shrank into gray mist. Agnes watched it disappear without tears. Children who grow up with uncertainty do not cling easily to places. They learn that attachment can be dangerous. The ocean did not welcome them. Months passed in the slow suffering of migration. Food spoiled, water fouled. Illness moved easily through cramped quarters. People weakened. Some did not survive. The ship itself groaned and shifted like a living thing, its timbers creaking under the pressure of waves that did not care who crossed them. Agnes learned another lesson there, that fear is useless unless it sharpens you, that endurance is quieter than panic, that if you keep breathing, the moment eventually changes. By the time land appeared again, a harsh, unfamiliar line beneath a brutal sun, she was no longer just a girl leaving Scotland. She was someone who had already crossed a boundary. Melbourne in 1840 was barely a place. It was an idea still under construction. Mud streets, timber huts, smoke rising from scattered fires, livestock wandering without fences, people building lives with tools still wet from the sea. Agnes stepped onto the soil of the colony with no sense of arrival, only continuation. Work came quickly. It always did. She became a dairymaid, rising before dawn, hands numbing in the cold as she milked cattle that were as restless and uncertain as the people who tended them. The routine was familiar. Labor had a language she already spoke fluently, but this land was different. The distances were larger, the silence deeper, the danger less visible and more absolute. Nearby lived a man named Hugh Buntine, a widower, a brickmaker, a man already marked by loss. He had crossed the same ocean and buried parts of his life on the way. His grief was quiet, carried in posture rather than words. People like him and Agnes recognized each other instinctively. They did not bond over dreams. They bonded over survival. Their connection grew slowly, shaped by proximity and necessity rather than romance, in a frontier where loneliness could kill as surely as hunger. Companionship became a form of shelter. When Agnes married Hugh in October of 1840, it was not the beginning of an easy life. It was the beginning of a harder one, because marriage did not free her from labor. It multiplied it, and the land they chose next would demand far more than either of them yet understood. Ahead waited forests without paths, mountains without mercy, and a place called Gippsland, still mostly unknown, already unforgiving. Agnes did not know then that this land would define her, only that she would walk into it the same way she had walked into everything else in her life, without ceremony, without permission, and without turning back. The decision to leave Melbourne came quietly. There was no single moment when Agnes or Hugh declared that they were finished with Glen Huntly. No argument with neighbors, no dramatic failure, just the slow, grinding realization that survival was not the same as living, and that the land around them, already claimed and measured, would never truly belong to them. Mary Creek was the next attempt. It lay farther out, less settled, spoken of with cautious optimism. Water flowed there. The soil looked generous enough. Hugh believed that if they worked hard enough, if they endured long enough, the land might finally yield something more than subsistence. Agnes followed. She was already pregnant when they moved. Her body carried 2 weights now, the child growing inside her, and the constant labor demanded by frontier life. There was no pause for fragility. Pregnancy did not excuse you from work in the colony. It simply reshaped how you carried it. Mary Creek did not reward them. The tools broke. Crops struggled. Livestock demanded attention that never translated into profit. Days began before sunrise and ended long after dark. Yet poverty remained close enough to touch. It hovered in every decision, every calculation of food, every worn-out piece of clothing patched one more time. At night, Agnes lay awake listening to the land. Not the comforting sounds of civilization, but the raw noises of a place still deciding what it would allow. Wind moving through grass, animals shifting unseen, the faint sense that they were temporary guests in a world that did not need them. It was there, between exhaustion and disappointment, that the name Gippsland began to surface again. Travelers spoke of it in fragments: dense forests, wide plains, mountains that cut the sky. A region so isolated that few settlers had dared to claim it properly. But isolation, to people like Agnes and Hugh, did not sound like a warning. It sounded like space. Space to begin again. Space to fail or succeed on their own terms. Space where no one could say the land was already taken. The journey toward Gippsland was not marked by roads. It was marked by uncertainty. Agnes was 7 months pregnant when they set out. The tracks narrowed quickly, thinning into little more than suggestions pressed into soil by earlier travelers. Trees closed in. Light filtered unevenly through branches overhead. Each step forward felt like moving deeper into something that had never agreed to be known. They traveled slowly. Hugh walked ahead, scanning the ground. Agnes followed, steady despite the strain in her body. She had learned long ago that fear wastes energy. You save strength for what you can control. Some nights, they camped beneath open sky. Other nights, beneath trees so thick they swallowed starlight. The forest watched them without reaction. It did not welcome. It did not resist. It simply existed. By the time they reached Port Albert, Agnes's body could carry no more. Their son was born there, small, fragile, alive. They named him Albert. Among the settlers scattered across the region, word spread quickly. Albert was spoken of as the first white child born in Gippsland. The title carried a strange weight, though no celebration followed it. There were no banners, no records carefully written, just a baby crying in a rough shelter, and a woman holding him with hands that would not shake. For Agnes, motherhood did not soften the land. It sharpened her awareness of what failure would mean. They moved again, deeper inland, building a small hut north of Port Albert. It was crude, but it stood. Walls held against wind, a roof held against rain. That was enough. The days took on a brutal rhythm, tending crops, caring for animals, raising children in a place without neighbors close enough to call for help. They opened a modest stopping place for travelers, a bush inn. Nothing more. A fire, rough food, a place to rest. People passing through began to know it by reputation rather than name, and they began to know Agnes. They called her Mother Buntine. Some called her the White Mother of Gippsland. She did not ask for the title. It arrived because she did what others could not, or would not. She fed travelers when food was scarce. She held sick children when their parents were too exhausted to stand. She remained upright in a land that bent people until they broke. But Gippsland carried shadows. This land was not empty. The Gunai-Kurnai people had lived here long before fences, before surveys, before names were written on maps. Their presence was woven into the land itself, and as settlers pushed deeper, violence followed. Agnes did not record these things. Most settlers didn't. but the air held memory. The silence carried weight, and some places felt wrong beneath the feet. Hugh acquired land through the systems of the colony, the same systems that erased others quietly and efficiently. Whether Agnes questioned it, history does not say. What is known is that survival rarely leaves room for reflection when every day demands action. They worked, they endured, they raised children, and still, poverty remained. The inn brought little profit, the land demanded more than it gave. And Hugh, once strong, began to slow. His movements grew heavier, his breath shorter. Illness settled into him without name or cure. Agnes noticed. She said nothing, because she understood something Hugh did not yet allow himself to see. The life they were living could not carry them much longer, and soon. The land would force her to make a choice that would change everything. Not as a wife, not as a mother, but as a woman willing to step onto a road no one expected her to survive. Hugh did not collapse. That was the cruel part. He faded. Strength left him the way daylight leaves a valley. Slowly, unevenly, without warning when the last warmth is gone. At first, it was small things. He rested longer between tasks. He stopped walking as far. His hands trembled when lifting tools that once felt weightless. Agnes noticed everything. She always had. She watched the way he leaned against doorframes before moving again, the way he paused to catch his breath when he thought no one was looking, the way his eyes stayed fixed on the ground. As if staring too far ahead required effort he could no longer afford. Illness in Gippsland had no names, no treatments, no mercy. You endured until you couldn't, and when you couldn't. The land moved on without you. The children felt it before it was spoken. They grew quieter. Older hands took on heavier work. Younger ones learned to stay out of the way. Agnes did not ask them to grow up faster. The frontier did. Each day brought the same arithmetic, and the answer never changed. Food cost more than they earned. Supplies ran out faster than they could replace them. The inn brought gratitude, but little money. Agnes lay awake at night doing calculations in her head. Not dreams, not wishes. Calculations. How long before the cattle thinned? How many weeks of flour remained? What happened if Hugh could no longer work at all? The answers were never comforting. And then came the gold. At first, it arrived as noise, rumors drifting through the bush like sparks carried by wind. Men passing through spoke of rivers heavy with promise, of hills that gave up wealth to anyone willing to dig, of towns erupting overnight, filled with hunger, chaos, and need. Gold did not sound like salvation to Agnes, but transport did. Those new places needed food, tools, timber, everything, and nothing reached them easily. Roads were narrow, dangerous, unfinished. Wagons broke, animals died, men turned back. Agnes listened. She said nothing. She watched Hugh struggle to rise one morning and understood something with sudden clarity. The life she was living would end one of two ways. Either it would starve them slowly, or she would change it herself. The idea did not come like inspiration. It came like necessity. Bullock driving was men's work. Everyone knew that. It demanded endurance, strength, and a willingness to face terrain that did not forgive mistakes. It meant walking for days, sleeping in mud, fighting weather, animals, fire, and other men. Women did not do it. That was precisely why it paid. Agnes did not ask permission. She observed the teams that passed through. She studied how yokes were fitted, how men used the whip, not to strike, but to speak. She listened to the sounds animals responded to. She learned which men were careless and which survived. At night, while others slept. She thought about her hands, her back, her legs. She thought about how many miles she had already walked in her life. More than most men who claimed the roads. The decision formed without ceremony. One morning, she told Hugh, not with drama, not with fear, just the truth. She would take a load. She would drive it herself. She would bring money back, or she would not return. Hugh did not argue. He could not. He looked at her with something that hovered between pride and worry and resignation. He had married a woman shaped by endurance, not comfort. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that stopping her would not save them. The children watched quietly as she prepared. Agnes dressed differently than other women. Shorter skirts, heavy boots, leather leggings, clothing made for movement. Not modesty. She tied her hair back tightly. She checked the yokes twice. She placed pistols at her belt, not to threaten, but to survive. The bullocks were massive animals, slow, stubborn, powerful. They tested anyone who claimed authority over them. Agnes met their gaze without flinching. The first steps onto the road were not heroic. They were practical. She walked beside the team, feeling the weight through the harness, adjusting her pace to theirs. The wagon groaned. The animals breathed heavily. Dust rose around her boots. Men watched from a distance. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. Some waited for failure. Agnes did not look back. The road did not care who she was. It cared only whether she could endure it. By the end of the first day, her legs burned. Her hands ached. Her voice was hoarse from command and correction. She slept on the ground beside her team, wrapped in a thin blanket, listening to the night move around her. She did not feel fear. She felt focus, because for the first time, the equation had changed. She was no longer waiting for survival. She was walking directly toward it, and the road, long, indifferent, unforgiving, opened beneath her feet, ready to test whether she deserved to remain standing. The second morning came without mercy. Agnes woke before light, her body stiff from cold ground and unfamiliar strain. Every joint reminded her that this was not work meant to be gentle. The bullocks stood nearby, broad shapes in the dark, steam rising slowly from their backs as they breathed. They did not rush. They never did. Power like theirs moved on its own terms. She stood, brushed dirt from her clothes, and began again. There was no moment of triumph when the sun rose. Just pale light spilling over uneven land, revealing a road that barely qualified as one. Ruts carved by earlier wagons, stones sharp enough to crack wheels, mud still holding the memory of last night's rain. Agnes took her place beside the lead bullock. She did not ride. She did not sit. She walked, hour after hour, step after step. She learned the truth of the work in her muscles. The whip was not for anger. It was language. A sharp crack to guide, a softer sound to correct. Silence when trust was enough. The animals tested her. One lagged deliberately, dragging its weight. Another leaned too far toward the edge of the track where the ground gave way. Agnes corrected them without panic. She had learned long ago that force wasted energy. Precision did not. By midday, the heat pressed down hard. Sweat soaked her clothes. Dust clung to her skin. Her throat burned. Still, she kept pace. She thought of Hugh, of his weakened hands, of the way he tried to hide his exhaustion, of the children who watched everything, even when they pretended not to. Turning back was not an option. Men passed her on horseback. Some slowed, surprised. Some stared openly. A few called out remarks meant to cut. Agnes did not respond. The road did not reward attention to noise. That night, she camped again. This time, she chose her ground carefully. Not too close to trees, not too open to wind. She fed the bullocks first, always first. An exhausted team was a dead team. She ate what little she carried and lay staring at the sky. It was wider than any she had known as a child, endless, unconcerned. The kind of sky that made people feel small unless they had already accepted that truth. She slept lightly. The days blurred into pattern. Walk, guide, correct, endure. Her body adapted the way it always had. Pain settled into something usable. Hunger sharpened focus instead of weakening it. Her voice grew steady, confident, carrying authority the animals responded to instinctively. By the time she reached her destination, she did not arrive like a novelty. She arrived like a solution. The settlement was chaotic. Half-built structures, men arguing over claims, supplies dangerously low. When Agnes's wagon rolled in, dust-covered and intact, people stopped what they were doing. They watched her unload. Cheese, butter, food that meant survival. No one laughed then. She sold quickly, efficiently, without ceremony. The money was heavy in her hand, not because it was much, but because it was proof. Proof that the road had not defeated her. That night, she slept indoors, for the first time since leaving home. The floor was hard, the walls thin. It did not matter. She slept deeply, without dreams. The return journey was no easier. The road did not soften out of respect. Rain turned tracks into traps. One wheel sank deep enough that men watching were certain she would fail. Agnes did not rush. She adjusted weight, repositioned the team, waited for the right angle. When the wagon came free, no one cheered. They simply stared. By the time she returned to Gippsland, thinner, darker, and stronger. Word had traveled ahead of her. Agnes Buntine had taken a load where men had turned back. She brought money home. She brought food. She brought certainty. Hugh did not smile when he saw her. He closed his eyes instead. Not in relief, in understanding. The road had changed her, and it would not let her go. She rested only briefly, because once people learned what she could do, they came. Merchants, miners, men who needed someone who did not quit. Agnes listened, calculated, accepted. The bullocks grew accustomed to her rhythm. They responded faster, trusted deeper. A good team was built, not bought. The work multiplied, so did the danger. Mountains rose ahead, forests thickened, weather turned without warning. And somewhere beyond the next range waited fires, floods, and a town called Walhalla, perched in terrain so brutal that even seasoned drivers refused to enter it. Agnes did not know that name yet, only that the road was growing steeper, and that every mile forward erased the possibility of turning back. The land was no longer testing her out of curiosity. It was measuring her worth, and Agnes kept walking. The land did not announce its dangers. It waited. Agnes learned that quickly. The most dangerous roads were never the ones that looked threatening. They were the quiet ones, the narrow tracks where nothing seemed wrong, until it was. Her work multiplied faster than her body could recover. Load after load, distance after distance, days that began before light and ended long after it vanished. She moved through forests that swallowed sound, through plains where the wind cut skin raw, through gullies where wagons tipped and disappeared without leaving much behind. Each journey demanded the same thing the last had demanded: absolute attention. One mistake was enough. She had seen what happened to drivers who lost focus: broken wheels, crushed legs, bodies pinned beneath weight that did not forgive weakness. The road did not care how hard you had worked yesterday. It cared only about the moment you were standing in. Agnes walked beside her team, boots wearing the same path into the earth over and over again. She knew every animal by temperament. Which one would balk on slopes? Which one pulled too eagerly downhill? Which one needed a word instead of a whip? The whip remained at her side, but it was rarely used for force. Sound mattered more than violence. Men noticed. They watched her from campsites and roadside clearings. Watched how she handled the team, how she spoke to the animals, how she chose her routes without hesitation. Some asked questions. Others watched in silence. A few took offense, a woman doing what they struggled to survive. And lawless. Agnes did not engage. She had learned that argument wasted strength, but danger did not always come from terrain. Sometimes it came from people. On isolated stretches, men appeared who were not looking for trade. Bushrangers, desperate travelers, men who believed isolation erased consequence. Agnes met them with stillness. She did not threaten. She did not plead. She let them see the pistols at her belt, the whip in her hand, the confidence of someone who had already decided how far she was willing to go. Most moved on. A few tested her. They learned quickly that the road had sharpened her beyond expectation. Still, it was fire, not men, that nearly ended everything. The first sign was the air, dry, too dry, sharp in the throat. The bullocks sensed it before she did. Their pace slowed, heads lifted, nostrils flared. Agnes followed their gaze and saw the faintest haze threading between the trees. Smoke. At first, it seemed distant, a fire far enough away to avoid. But fire did not obey distance. It obeyed wind, and the wind turned. The heat arrived like a wall. The forest crackled, leaves curled, sparks drifted ahead of the flames, landing silently in dry grass. Agnes urged the team forward, knowing speed was their only chance. The road narrowed, the wagon slowed. Behind her, the fire roared, not like flame, but like breath drawn too deeply. Agnes made a decision that would define her survival. She did not try to outrun it. She turned toward ground that had already burned. Charred earth, blackened stumps, a place where the fire had nothing left to consume. She drove the bullocks into it, commanding them through panic. The animals resisted, instincts screaming danger. Agnes overrode them with force of will and sound. The wagon caught first. Flames climbed its frame. Canvas ignited. The load crackled and collapsed inward. Agnes beat at it with her coat until the heat drove her back. There was no saving it. She dropped to the ground, pressing herself into ash-stained earth, covered her face, held her breath. The fire passed over her like something alive. When it moved on, silence followed. The wagon was gone. The bullocks stood, burned but alive. Agnes stood with them. Her clothes were scorched, her hands blistered, her face streaked with soot. She did not cry. She did not curse. She gathered the animals and walked. Miles later, she reached safety. Word spread faster than smoke. Agnes Buntine had walked through fire and lived. Some told it as admiration, others as warning. But the road did not slow for legend. If anything, it grew steeper. Ahead waited terrain even seasoned drivers avoided. Mountains cut deep by ravines, tracks barely wide enough for wheels. A place spoken of in lowered voices. Walhalla. Men said no loaded wagon could reach it. Agnes listened. She did not argue. She began preparing. Because the road had already taught her its final rule. Survival belonged not to the strongest, but to the one who refused to stop walking. Walhalla did not appear on most maps. It existed instead in rumor and warning, spoken of by men who had turned back, by traders who had lost wagons, by drivers who lowered their voices when the name surfaced. It was a place folded deep into the mountains, where valleys closed in like traps and roads clung to cliffs with no margin for error. People said you didn't go to Walhalla. You survived it, if you were lucky. Agnes heard the stories the same way she heard everything else, without reaction. She asked questions. She listened carefully. She pictured the terrain in her mind. Steep descents, blind corners, creeks that rose without warning, mud that swallowed wheels whole. The miners there were desperate. Food was scarce, supplies rarer still. Men worked claims on empty stomachs, growing weaker by the day. Merchants refused the route. Drivers laughed at the idea. No one wanted the job, which meant it paid. Agnes made her decision the way she always did, quietly, deliberately, and without asking for approval. She prepared her team with care, checked every yoke, replaced worn straps, balanced the load until it sat perfectly. Not light, but controlled. There was a difference. She set out before dawn. The mountains rose ahead like a challenge that did not need words. Mist clung low, hiding drop-offs until the last moment. The road narrowed quickly, thinning into something that barely deserved the name. Agnes walked, always walking. She positioned herself where she could see everything: ground, animals, wagon, sky. Her pace slowed. Every step was measured, every command precise. The bullocks responded, sensing the seriousness in her voice. The first descent tested her immediately. The path dropped sharply, wheels groaning as gravity pulled against restraint. Agnes wedged her body against the wheel, boots digging into loose soil, using her weight to steady the wagon. One slip meant disaster. She did not slip. Men appeared along the track, miners returning empty-handed, staring in disbelief as her team crept downward. Some shouted warnings. Others simply watched, waiting for failure. Agnes did not look up. The mountain did not reward distraction. Creeks followed. Cold water surged around hooves and wheels, pushing hard against progress. Agnes tested depth with her staff before committing. When the water rose too quickly, she waited. Patience saved lives on roads like these. Hours stretched. Progress slowed to a crawl. By the time the settlement came into view, tents clinging to slopes, smoke rising thinly into mountain air. The miners had already heard she was coming. They lined the track. Silent now, as her wagon emerged intact. Food, real food. She unloaded without ceremony. Flour, salted meat, supplies that meant another week of survival. Then she did something no one expected. She chose one of her bullocks, an animal she had trained, trusted, relied upon, and slaughtered it, not for profit, for them. The miners ate that night, properly, fully. Some cried without realizing they were doing it. Strength returned to bodies worn thin by hunger and hope. Word spread fast. Agnes Buntine had driven a loaded wagon into Walhalla. She had done what no one else could. She did not stay long. The road back was waiting. The climb out was worse than the descent. Wheels strained, harnesses groaned. The mountain tested every ounce of control she possessed. Agnes answered it with patience and refusal to yield. When she reached the top, she did not stop. She kept walking. From that journey forward, her name moved ahead of her. Merchants sought her out. Miners asked for her by name. Drivers who once laughed now watched closely. Measuring themselves against what she had done, Agnes did not become softer. She became sharper. Because the road had accepted her. And once it does, it never lets go. The mountains fell away behind her as she returned to Gippsland. Smoke rose from familiar ground. The inn stood where she had left it. Hugh waited, older now, weaker still, but alive. She had brought money. She had brought food. She had brought proof. That night, as she lay on the ground beside her resting team, Agnes stared up at the sky once more. It felt closer here, framed by peaks she had conquered. She did not feel pride. She felt certainty. The road was no longer something she visited. It was something she belonged to. And far ahead, beyond Gippsland, beyond Walhalla, beyond even legend, the road continued, ready to take everything she had left to give, before Agnes Buntine became a name spoken on the roads, before her footsteps carved familiarity into wilderness. She was simply Agnes Davidson, a child shaped by a city that offered no protection. Glasgow did not raise children gently. It raised them quickly, or it did not raise them at all. Agnes was born in 1822 into a world of stone and smoke, where narrow streets trapped cold air and daylight struggled to reach the ground. Houses leaned inward, crowded with families who shared walls. Hunger and exhaustion. The city breathed in soot and breathed out labor. Her family was large, too large for comfort. Her father, John Davidson, worked land that barely sustained them. Her mother, Sarah, kept order not with softness, but with resolve. There was no space for weakness from her earliest years. Agnes understood that survival was a collective effort. Everyone contributed, even children, especially children. She fetched water before her arms had grown strong enough to lift full buckets easily. She learned to carry weight before she learned to complain. Cold became normal. Hunger became familiar. Fatigue became routine. There are no records of Agnes learning to read by candlelight or dreaming of a future beyond her street. Girls like her were not raised to imagine. They were raised to endure. Education, where it appeared at all, was brief and practical, enough to function, never enough to escape. Her world smelled of damp stone and animals, of boiled meals stretched thin to feed many mouths, of sweat earned honestly and spent too quickly. Neighbors lived close enough to hear arguments through walls, close enough to share both misfortune and resilience. Agnes grew strong without noticing it. Her body adapted because it had to. Muscles formed not from choice, but repetition. Endurance settled into her bones quietly, unnoticed by anyone, including herself. She learned how to move efficiently, how to save energy, how to observe before acting. She learned another lesson too, that no one was coming to rescue you. Glasgow was changing rapidly in those years. Industry expanded, factories multiplied. Opportunities existed, but they belonged unevenly for families like the Davidsons. Each advancement only sharpened the contrast between promise and reality. Illness moved easily through crowded homes. A single fever could dismantle a household. A missed day of work could collapse an entire week's plan. Agnes watched adults age quickly under pressure, watched neighbors disappear without explanation. Loss was common. Grief was quiet. Life continued regardless. She learned to read people early, to sense moods, to understand when silence was safer than speech. These skills, learned in cramped rooms and shared hardship, would later serve her better than any formal education ever could. As she grew older, she worked more, fetching, carrying, assisting wherever her hands were needed. Her labor was never praised. It was expected. Praise was a luxury. Survival was currency. Yet something formed inside her during those years, something hard to name. Not ambition, not rebellion, a steadiness, a quiet certainty that no matter how narrow the path, she would walk it. When talk of migration began circulating, stories of a distant land called Australia, Agnes listened without excitement. She had learned that promises often exaggerated truth, but she also recognized desperation when she heard it. Her parents weighed the decision carefully. Scotland was known suffering. Australia was unknown risk, for people already living at the edge. Unknown risk did not always feel worse than certain decline. Agnes did not fear leaving. Children who grow up without stability rarely cling to place. They cling to people, to routines, to anything that resembles continuity, and even those attachments are tentative. When the decision was made, she helped prepare without sentiment. Possessions were few. Memories were not portable. What mattered was movement. The ship that would carry them away waited like a threshold. Stepping onto it meant surrendering familiarity for possibility. Agnes crossed that threshold quietly, without ceremony, without looking back. She carried with her no illusions, only a body trained to endure, a mind sharpened by observation, and a spirit already accustomed to hardship. The road had not yet appeared beneath her feet, but everything in her childhood had been preparing her to walk it. The ship did not feel like escape. It felt like surrender, wooden, crowded, and already exhausted by the weight of lives stacked inside it. The vessel waited at the edge of Scotland like something alive, but indifferent. When Agnes stepped aboard in 1939, she understood instinctively that the ocean ahead would not reward hope. It would test endurance. Below deck, the air was heavy and stale. Families pressed close together, sharing narrow spaces where privacy vanished within hours. The smell of salt mixed with sickness, unwashed bodies, and food that spoiled faster than it could be eaten. Light filtered weakly through small openings, turning days into a gray blur. Agnes adapted quickly. She learned where to stand when the ship rolled, how to brace herself when waves struck the hull with sudden violence. She learned to sleep lightly, to wake at unfamiliar sounds, to conserve energy when nothing demanded it immediately. Others struggled. Children cried through nights they did not understand. Adults argued over space, over rations, over imagined slights magnified by exhaustion. Illness spread easily. A cough became a fever. A fever became silence. Agnes watched. She did not avert her eyes. She helped when she could, fetching water, steadying the sick, holding children whose parents were too weak to stand. Not out of kindness alone, but because shared survival required it. A weakened group endangered everyone. The ocean showed no mercy. Storms rose without warning, tossing the ship like a toy. Waves slammed against the hull with a force that rattled bones. People prayed loudly. Others retreated into themselves. Agnes held fast, gripping whatever she could reach, letting motion pass through her rather than fight it. She learned another truth there. Resistance wasted strength. Adaptation preserved it. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. Time lost meaning beyond routine. Wake, endure, rest, repeat. The horizon never changed. The water never softened. The ship groaned constantly, reminding its passengers that survival depended as much on wood and iron as on will. Death visited quietly, not with ceremony, but with absence. A body removed, a space left empty, Conversations lowered. Life pressed on. Agnes understood that grief did not pause necessity. You mourned later, if you survived. When land finally appeared, it did not look like promise. It looked harsh. Bright sun, strange vegetation, a shoreline that offered no familiarity. The air itself felt different, drier, heavier, unfamiliar to lungs shaped by Scottish damp and cold. They had arrived near Melbourne. The settlement was young, uncertain, unfinished. Huts stood unevenly along muddy paths. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Livestock wandered freely. Everything looked temporary, as if it might be abandoned at any moment. Agnes stepped onto Australian soil without ceremony. She did not feel reborn. She felt continued. Work came immediately. Dairy work. Mostly. Rising before dawn. Hands numb in morning cold. Cattle restless. Unfamiliar. Resistant to inexperienced handlers. Agnes learned quickly. She always did. Rhythm mattered. Calm mattered. Fear only unsettled animals further. The days were long. The pay was small. But the work was honest. And honesty mattered more than comfort. Melbourne was not yet a city. It was an idea struggling to become solid. People arrived daily, bringing ambition, desperation, and uncertainty in equal measure. There were opportunities, but they favored those willing to work without complaint. Agnes fit that world easily. She noticed a man nearby, Hugh Buntine. He worked with brick and tile, his hands thick, his posture marked by fatigue. He carried grief without display, a widower who had lost children, then a wife. He moved through his days with quiet determination. They did not speak much at first. They did not need to. They recognized something familiar in each other, people shaped not by hope, but by persistence. Their conversations were practical, their silences comfortable, in a place where loneliness pressed hard against newcomers. That mattered. Their bond grew slowly. Without romance, marriage followed in 1840, not as culmination, but as continuation, a partnership formed out of necessity and mutual understanding. Agnes stepped into the role of wife without illusion. Marriage did not promise ease, it promised shared burden. She accepted it. Together. They moved outward, away from the crowded edges of settlement toward land that still resisted claim. Glen Huntly, then farther, always farther. Agnes learned that Australia rewarded movement. Those who stayed too close to others competed for scraps. Those who pushed outward faced danger, but also possibility. She carried those lessons forward without comment. The ocean had stripped away softness. The colony demanded usefulness. And Agnes Davidson, now Agnes Buntine, was becoming something the land recognized. Not a dreamer, not a conqueror, but a woman who endured long enough to be noticed. The road was not yet hers, but it was drawing closer. Marriage did not change Agnes's life. It clarified it. When she became Agnes Buntine, she did not step into comfort or security. She stepped into responsibility, layered upon responsibility. The land did not care that vows had been spoken. It did not soften because two people now shared a name. If anything, it demanded more. Hugh was a steady man, practical and worn by loss. He had already learned that hope was fragile, that life in the colony rewarded effort but never guaranteed return. Together, they moved with the quiet efficiency of people who did not waste time imagining different circumstances. They tried to build something at Mary Creek. On paper, it made sense. Water nearby, soil that looked workable, space enough to believe that effort might finally turn into stability. Hugh labored from dawn to dark. Agnes worked beside him. Then beyond him, tending animals, managing the house, preparing food, carrying weight that did not distinguish between men and women. But Mary Creek resisted them. Crops failed more often than they succeeded. Tools broke and could not easily be replaced. Livestock required constant attention yet brought little profit. Every improvement seemed to invite a setback. Agnes did not complain. She observed. She noted how the land responded to weather, how long recovery took after loss, how easily one illness could undo weeks of effort. She learned the signs of soil exhaustion, the moods of animals, the patterns of survival that never appeared in instruction. She also learned something else. Effort alone was not enough. They worked harder than most, yet poverty remained close, persistent, patient. It waited at the edge of every calculation. It shaped every decision. It made rest feel dangerous. At night, Agnes listened to the land. Not the reassuring sounds of a settled place, but the alert quiet of territory still undecided. Wind moving through tall grass. Animals unseen but present. A sense of being observed by something older than ownership. It was during those nights that she began to understand the frontier more clearly. This was not a place to settle easily. It was a place to adapt or leave. The stories of Gippsland returned. They arrived through travelers, through fragments of conversation exchanged at stopping points, through men who spoke with equal parts fear and fascination. Dense forests, vast plains, rivers that flooded without warning. A region still largely untouched by settlers, and that was the point. Gippsland was dangerous, but it was not crowded. Agnes felt the pull immediately. Not excitement, not longing, recognition. She understood places like that, places that did not pretend to be generous, places that demanded clarity and strength from anyone who entered them. When Hugh spoke of moving again, she did not hesitate. They packed what they could carry, left behind what had already proven useless. Agnes was pregnant when they set out, her body already under strain. The journey itself was unforgiving, tracks narrowing into forest, ground softening beneath their feet, the sense of distance stretching beyond calculation. She walked anyway. Pregnancy did not excuse her from labor. It merely required adjustment. She learned to pace herself differently, to listen more closely to her body while refusing to let it dictate fear. Each step forward was deliberate. The forest deepened. Light thinned. Sound softened. The world closed in. At Port Albert, her body demanded rest. Their son was born there, in a place barely prepared for life at all. They named him Albert. The moment passed without ceremony, without witnesses beyond necessity. But word spread quickly. The first white child born in Gippsland. The title meant little to Agnes. Children were not symbols to her. They were responsibility made visible, proof that failure now carried consequences beyond hunger. They moved again, built a small hut north of Port Albert, rough walls, a roof that barely held. Enough. Agnes learned the rhythms of Gippsland slowly, the way mist settled in mornings, the way rain transformed creeks into threats, the way silence could mean safety or danger. They opened a small bush inn for travelers, a fire, food when available, shelter for those who needed it. People began to stop, to talk, to leave stories behind. They also left warning. This land was not empty. The Gunai Kurnai people moved through it with knowledge far older than fences or titles. Their presence was constant, even when unseen. Tension followed settlers everywhere. Violence lingered in the air. Unspoken, but understood. Agnes did not record her thoughts on this. Survival did not invite reflection. It demanded action. The inn brought recognition, but little money. Hugh's strength declined gradually. Not suddenly. Gradually enough that denial remained possible for a time. But Agnes noticed the change before he admitted it. He tired faster, recovered slower, rested more. She adjusted, took on more, spoke less, planned carefully, because marriage had not ended her struggle. It had revealed its true shape, and Gippsland, vast, indifferent, demanding, was preparing her for a decision that would place her alone on roads no one else was willing to walk. The road was no longer approaching. It was waiting. The decision to leave Scotland did not come with celebration. It came with silence. In the Davidson household, silence usually meant agreement, an unspoken understanding that there were no good options left, only necessary ones. Poverty had a way of stripping choices down to their bare bones. You either stayed and slowly disappeared, or you risked everything for the possibility of something different. Agnes was 17 when the preparations began. She watched her parents sort through what little they owned with practiced restraint, clothing worn thin by years of use, tools that had already proven their worth, small personal items weighed not by sentiment, but by usefulness. Anything that did not serve survival was left behind. This was not heartbreak. This was logistics. Neighbors came and went, offering advice wrapped in rumor. Some spoke of Australia as a land of opportunity. Others described it as a place where people vanished into distance and never returned. The truth: no one really knew, but the ship was waiting, and hesitation did not fill empty stomachs. On the day of departure, Glasgow was gray and unremarkable. The city did not mark their leaving. It never did. Too many people passed through its streets to remember individual departures. Agnes did not look back as they walked toward the harbor. She had already learned that attachment to place was a liability. The ship was larger than anything she had ever seen. Its hull loomed dark against the water, scarred by previous crossings. It smelled of salt, damp wood, and the faint trace of fear left behind by earlier passengers. People clustered near the gangplank, holding bundles that represented entire lives reduced to what could be carried. Agnes stepped aboard without hesitation. The moment her foot touched the deck, the world she knew began to recede, not dramatically, but inevitably. Scotland became something behind her, something already unreachable, below deck. Reality set in quickly. The space was cramped, low-ceilinged, and dim. Families were assigned narrow areas separated by little more than rope or fabric. Privacy vanished instantly. Sounds traveled. Smells lingered. Every movement affected someone else. Agnes adjusted. She always did. She learned where to sit so the sway of the ship was manageable, how to brace herself during rough water, how to move efficiently in tight spaces without drawing attention. These were not skills taught. They were absorbed. The ocean revealed itself slowly. At first, it was only motion, the constant rise and fall beneath her feet. Then came the storms, waves striking the hull with sudden violence, rattling everything loose, water forcing its way through seams never meant to hold forever. People screamed, prayed, vomited. Agnes held on. She did not romanticize the journey. She understood instinctively that the sea did not test courage. It tested endurance. Panic exhausted you. Calm preserved you. Weeks blurred into one another. Food diminished in quality and quantity. Water tasted stale. Illness spread easily through confined bodies. A cough passed from person to person. Fever followed. Some passengers weakened beyond recovery. Death came quietly, a body wrapped, removed, gone. The ship moved on. Agnes watched these things without turning away. She learned that grief did not stop necessity. If you stopped moving, the journey would not pause for you. She helped where she could, held children whose parents were too sick to stand, carried water, cleaned when others could not. Not out of heroism, but because shared survival demanded cooperation. A sick ship endangered everyone aboard. At night, she lay awake listening to the sounds of the vessel, the groan of wood under pressure, the endless rush of water, the muted breathing of strangers packed too closely together. She did not dream. Dreams belonged to people who believed the future owed them something. Months passed. When land finally appeared, it did not arrive as relief. It arrived as shock. The sun was harsher, the colors unfamiliar. The shoreline looked unfinished, almost hostile. This was not the green softness of Scotland. This was a place that made no effort to welcome. Some passengers cheered, others cried. Agnes simply watched. The ship docked near Melbourne, a settlement still uncertain of its own existence. Timber huts stood unevenly along muddy tracks. Smoke drifted from small fires. Animals moved freely, unconcerned with human plans. Stepping onto the soil of the colony felt less like arrival and more like exposure. There were no guarantees here, only opportunity sharpened by risk. Agnes took it in without comment. She did not feel smaller. She felt measured against distance, against labor, against a land that would soon demand proof of worth. The ship had taken everything familiar. What remained was a girl hardened by poverty, sharpened by endurance, and standing at the edge of a continent that would soon learn her weight. The road had not yet begun. But it was closer now than it had ever been. Australia did not pause to let newcomers adjust. It demanded usefulness immediately. Melbourne in 1840 was less a city than a collection of intentions. Buildings stood where they could. Streets existed where people walked often enough to wear the ground flat. Nothing felt permanent. Everything felt provisional, as if the land itself had not yet decided whether to tolerate settlement. Agnes stepped into this uncertainty without hesitation. She had crossed an ocean to reach it. Standing still now would have made that crossing meaningless. Work found her quickly. It always did. Dairy work came first, rising before dawn, when the air still carried a faint chill. Cows unfamiliar with human handling shifted and resisted. Milk had to be earned, not taken. Agnes learned their temperaments the same way she would later learn oxen, by watching more than commanding. Her hands toughened further, her back strengthened. The rhythm of work settled into her body until it felt natural again. Survival, she knew, depended on consistency more than strength. Around her, the settlement grew unevenly. New arrivals flooded in. Some lasted weeks. Others vanished quietly, moving on, returning home, or disappearing into the margins where no one kept records. Disease lingered. Accidents were common. The colony rewarded those who adapted quickly and punished those who hesitated. Agnes adapted. She observed which people lasted and which did not. She noted patterns. Recklessness failed. Patience endured. Loud ambition attracted attention, but not longevity. Quiet persistence built something resembling stability. It was during these early months that she noticed Hugh Buntine more clearly. He worked with brick and tile, shaping permanence out of raw materials. His labor was steady, deliberate. He spoke little, listened more. His grief was visible only in small ways, in the careful distance he kept from others, in the way he avoided unnecessary attachment. Agnes recognized that restraint. They began speaking more often, usually about practical matters, where work could be found, which areas were safe, what routes travelers favored. There was no flirtation, no performance, just conversation shaped by necessity. Their closeness grew organically. Two people who had already lost too much to believe in easy promises found value in reliability. They did not dream together. They planned. They did not imagine comfort. They calculated survival. Marriage followed naturally. In October of 1840, Agnes became Agnes Buntine. The ceremony was modest. No illusions attached themselves to it. Marriage in the colony was not about romance. It was about shared labor, shared risk, and shared endurance. Agnes understood this clearly. She did not expect Hugh to protect her from hardship. She did not expect ease. She expected partnership, together. They moved outward from Melbourne, drawn by the same force that pulled many settlers. Space. Glen Huntly offered opportunity without crowding. Mary Creek promised water and workable land. They tried. They worked relentlessly. The land answered with indifference. Some seasons were better than others, but none were easy. Crops failed without explanation. Tools broke at the worst moments. Animals required constant attention and offered uncertain return. Poverty lingered like a shadow that shifted but never disappeared. Agnes did not romanticize struggle. She measured it. At night, she ran numbers in her head: supplies, distance, time. How long they could continue as they were before something broke: equipment, health, or spirit. She noticed Hugh changing, not dramatically, not all at once, slowly, subtly. He tired faster. His movements grew heavier. Rest took longer to restore him. He hid it as best he could. But Agnes saw everything. She said nothing. Observation came before action. The stories of Gippsland returned again during this period. Travelers spoke of it with hesitation. Dense forests, rivers that flooded without warning, isolation so complete that help arrived only if you survived long enough to need it. The land was said to be fertile, but unforgiving. Agnes listened carefully. She recognized the pattern. Settlements grew crowded. Land closer to Melbourne became expensive, competitive, strained. Those who pushed farther faced danger, but also autonomy. She did not fear danger. She feared stagnation. When Hugh spoke of moving again, Agnes agreed without hesitation. She was already pregnant by then, her body carrying the next proof that survival now extended beyond the two of them. They packed what they could, left what no longer mattered, prepared for distance rather than comfort. The journey into Gippsland did not resemble migration. It resembled infiltration. Tracks narrowed, trees thickened, the land closed in. Movement slowed to careful progress. Agnes walked despite the strain, adjusting her pace, conserving strength. Pregnancy altered her movement, but not her resolve. She learned to listen to her body without obeying it blindly. At Port Albert, her body finally demanded stillness. Their son was born there, in a place barely prepared for birth. They named him Albert. The moment passed quietly. No celebration, no witnesses beyond necessity. But the significance lingered. A child born at the edge of settlement meant permanence. Failure now had a face. They moved again, built a small hut north of Port Albert, opened a simple stopping place for travelers, food when available, shelter when needed. Agnes became a fixed point in a moving world. People noticed. They spoke of her steadiness, her reliability, her refusal to bend under pressure. Some called her Mother Buntine. Others simply returned again and again. The land remained difficult. Tension with the Gunai-Kurnai people was constant, often unspoken but ever present. Violence marked the region's history even when it was not openly acknowledged. Agnes lived within these complexities without the luxury of reflection. Survival demanded focus. Hugh weakened further. Agnes adjusted again, took on more responsibility, planned more carefully, watched the roads more closely. Because somewhere beyond Gippsland, beyond Mary Creek, beyond the Bush Inn and failing margins, a different kind of solution was forming. Not one that promised safety, but one that offered control. And control. Agnes understood. was sometimes the closest thing to freedom the frontier allowed. By the time Agnes realized that Melbourne, Mary Creek, and even Gippsland were only stages, not destinations, she had already stopped thinking of life as something that settled. Life. She understood now. Moved. It shifted like weather. It demanded adjustment. And those who survived were not the ones who resisted change, but the ones who learned how to walk alongside it without hesitation. The Bush Inn became a crossroads. Not a busy one, but an important one. Men passed through carrying news from goldfields still forming, from settlements collapsing under their own weight, from tracks that were being cut through forest by desperation rather than planning. They spoke of fortunes and failures with equal conviction. Most of what they said was exaggerated. Agnes learned to listen past the noise. What mattered was not gold. What mattered was movement. Goldfields created hunger. Hunger created demand. Demand created roads. Unfinished. Dangerous. Temporary roads. And roads needed drivers. Hugh could no longer walk them. His illness had settled into something permanent. It did not rage. It drained. Each day took more from him than the last. He still worked when he could, still insisted on usefulness. But Agnes could see the cost accumulating in his posture, in the careful way he rationed his strength. They spoke less about the future now, not because it frightened them, but because it had become obvious. The life they had built required more labor than Hugh could give. Agnes began doing what she had always done when a structure no longer held. She observed. She measured. She prepared. She watched bullock teams pass the inn. Heavy wagons groaning under load. Drivers walking beside them. Not riding, because riding meant loss of control. She noted how men spoke to the animals, how fear made their voices sharp, how patience calmed even the most stubborn beasts. She watched failures, too. Broken axles abandoned by the road, teams scattered after a driver lost authority, men stranded because they misjudged terrain or weather. She did not romanticize their mistakes. She learned from them. At night, while Hugh slept fitfully and the children lay curled together for warmth, Agnes sat with the quiet calculations that had guided her life since childhood. How far could a wagon go in a day? What loads paid best? Which routes killed drivers, and which merely tested them? She understood something crucial before she ever took the reins herself. Bullock driving was not brute force. It was judgment. It required the ability to read land, animals, and men simultaneously, to anticipate failure before it arrived, to decide quickly what could be saved and what had to be abandoned. Agnes had been doing that her entire life. The difference now was scale. The decision did not arrive as courage. It arrived as inevitability. She told Hugh plainly. Not as a confession, not as a question, as a plan. She would take work transporting goods. She would do it herself, not because she wanted to prove anything, but because it was the only path forward that did not end in slow collapse. Hugh listened in silence. He did not laugh. He did not protest. He knew his wife. He knew the steadiness beneath her words. And he knew, perhaps better than anyone, that the frontier respected capability far more than convention. The children listened too. They did not fully understand what was changing, but they sensed its weight. Agnes did not soften the truth for them. Softness had never protected anyone she knew. She prepared methodically. Her clothing changed first. Practical, shorter, built for movement, heavy boots replaced worn shoes. Leather leggings protected her legs from brush and cold. She carried pistols, not for threat, but for certainty. When she stood beside a bullock team for the first time as its driver, There was no audience, no announcement, just animals, harness, and distance. The bullocks tested her immediately. They always did. They leaned into their weight, delayed response, challenged her voice. Agnes answered with consistency rather than force. She learned which animal responded to sound, which to proximity, which needed time rather than pressure. By the end of the first day, her body ached in ways it never had before. But pain was not unfamiliar. She had carried worse. She slept on the ground beside her team that night. The sky wide above her, the land murmuring quietly around her. She did not feel fear. She felt alignment. Because for the first time, the demands placed on her matched the skills she had spent a lifetime developing. When she returned with money, real money, the shift became permanent. The road recognized her. Merchants returned. Then others followed. Work multiplied. So did danger. So did distance. But Agnes no longer walked blindly into uncertainty. She walked prepared. The ocean had taken her childhood. The frontier had stripped her illusions. What remained was something sharper. A woman who understood that survival was not given. It was carried, mile by mile, by those willing to walk where others stopped. And the road, long and unfinished, opened itself fully beneath her feet. Not as a promise, but as a test she was finally ready to pass. The road did not change for Agnes, but it began to recognize her. At first, it was subtle. A hesitation from other drivers when they saw her approaching, conversations that stopped mid-sentence, eyes that followed her longer than necessary. The frontier had a way of measuring people quickly, and once measured, it rarely revised its judgment. Agnes Buntine walked as she always had, beside the team, not above it. The bullocks moved with the steady patience of animals that had learned her language. Their massive shoulders rolled in rhythm, hooves sinking deep into soil that shifted between dust and mud without warning. She no longer counted miles. She counted conditions. The slope of the land, the smell of the air before rain, the sound a wheel made when it was close to failure. Her world narrowed to what mattered. Everything else fell away. Men began to speak her name before she arrived. Not loudly, not proudly, but with a kind of acknowledgement reserved for people who survived places others avoided. When merchants needed goods delivered across terrain that ruined wagons and reputations alike. They asked for Agnes, not because she was a woman who defied expectation, because she finished the job. The routes grew longer, the loads heavier, the risks sharper. She crossed rivers swollen with rain, water pushing hard against the legs of her team. She waited when waiting meant survival, and pushed forward when hesitation meant loss. She learned which creeks rose quickly and which gave warning, which forests held silence too deep to be safe. At night, she slept lightly, always aware of sound, a snapping branch, a shift in wind. The approach of men who believed isolation erased consequence. Agnes met them with calm certainty. The pistols stayed visible. The whip stayed ready. Her posture spoke louder than threat. Most moved on. Some tested her resolve. They did not test it twice. Her reputation spread along the same paths she walked, slowly, relentlessly, without embellishment. Stories changed with retelling, but the core remained consistent. She did not turn back. She did not abandon loads. She did not panic. That consistency mattered more than strength. The frontier respected reliability. As her work increased, so did the strain on her body. Joints stiffened, muscles burned longer after rest, cuts healed more slowly. Agnes noticed, but she did not slow. Pain was information, not instruction. She adjusted her pace, changed how she distributed weight, rested when rest preserved function rather than wasted time. Experience refined her endurance into efficiency. At home, the children grew older. They learned independence early. The eldest took on responsibility without being asked. The younger ones learned to watch, to listen, to understand when silence was required. Agnes did not shield them from reality. Reality was not something she believed in hiding. Hugh watched her leave each time with a mixture of pride and resignation. His strength continued to decline, his movements slower, his breath more deliberate. He no longer pretended otherwise. Their partnership changed shape. Agnes became the road. Hugh became the anchor. She brought back money, supplies, stability measured in weeks rather than days. The inn survived. The family endured. It was not comfort, but it was control, and control mattered. The road, however, never allowed complacency. Weather shifted without warning. A clear morning turned violent by afternoon. Wind carried embers far ahead of distant fires. A single spark could erase weeks of labor in moments. Agnes remained alert. She remembered the fire she had already survived, the heat, the decision to sacrifice what could not be saved. That lesson stayed with her. Nothing on the road was permanent. Not wagons, not goods, not even people. Only movement. As seasons passed, her name moved farther ahead of her, reached places she had not yet walked. Men who had never seen her spoke of her with certainty. Some exaggerated, some understated, but all agreed on one thing. If Agnes Buntine took the road would yield, not because it was kind, but because she refused to give it another option, and somewhere beyond the next ridge, beyond the next valley, beyond the next test of fire or flood, the land was preparing something new, not a challenge of distance, but a challenge of endurance measured in years. The road had learned her name. Now it would begin to collect its price. The road never demanded payment all at once. It collected slowly. Agnes felt it first in the mornings. The pause before standing. The stiffness that lingered longer than it used to. Muscles that once warmed quickly now needed patience. She adjusted without comment. Adjustment had always been her language. She did not speak of pain. Pain was information. Complaining was waste. The work continued to grow. Merchants relied on her because she did not gamble with promises. When she said she would deliver, she delivered, or she did not return. That certainty mattered in a colony where failure was common and excuses plentiful. She moved between settlements that barely existed yet depended on connection. Goldfields flared and dimmed. Camps rose overnight and vanished just as quickly. Through it all, the same hunger followed. Food, tools, supplies, the same need for someone willing to walk long distances beside heavy loads without surrender. Agnes filled that need, but each journey took something. Not enough to notice immediately, enough to accumulate. Cuts that healed slower, a knee that protested downhill slopes, a shoulder that burned after long days managing the team. She learned new efficiencies, changed how she distributed force, let the bullocks work where they could, and intervened only when necessary. Authority, she had learned, was quieter when it was real, at home. Hugh's decline could no longer be ignored. He moved carefully now, rationing strength. Tasks he once completed without thought now required planning. Agnes watched him from the corner of her eye, always calculating, always preparing for the moment when he could no longer contribute at all. They spoke less about it, not out of denial, but understanding. Some truths did not require repetition. The children adapted in their own ways. The eldest assumed responsibility naturally, stepping into gaps without instruction. The younger ones learned when to ask and when not to. Agnes did not soften her expectations. She was not raising children for comfort. She was raising them for survival. The Bush Inn continued to function, but it was no longer the center of their livelihood. Agnes's earnings from the road sustained them now. Each return brought supplies, money, proof that the system still worked, but the margin remained thin. One failed journey, one injured animal, one illness. The frontier did not forgive imbalance. Agnes remained vigilant. She watched the sky more closely than most, learned to read cloud movement, wind shifts, the smell of rain before it fell. She avoided routes that felt wrong, even when they promised shorter distance. Experience had taught her that shortcuts were expensive. Men on the road began to treat her differently, not as a curiosity, as a constant. They greeted her with nods rather than remarks, asked questions seriously, listened when she spoke. Some tried to imitate her methods. Few succeeded. Endurance could not be copied easily. It had to be lived. There were moments, rare, quiet moments, when Agnes felt the weight of isolation. Nights alone beside the team, fires burning low, stars cold and distant. Responsibility pressing inward from every direction. In those moments, she did not think of alternatives. She thought of continuity, the children sleeping safely. Hugh breathing steadily through the night, the next journey already forming in her mind. The road remained indifferent. It did not care about reputation. It did not reward loyalty. It tested each day as if no one had walked it before. Agnes accepted that without resentment. Resentment required energy better spent elsewhere. Then came the fires again, not close enough to threaten immediately, but close enough to sharpen memory. Smoke on the horizon, ash drifting farther than it should, wind carrying danger unpredictably. Agnes adjusted routes, delayed departures, waited when others rushed. Patience saved more loads than speed ever had. She remembered the wagon she had lost, the decision she had made, the clarity that came when choice narrowed to survival alone. Nothing on the road was irreplaceable, except life. Her reputation hardened further after that. Men said she had walked through fire and returned unchanged. They were wrong. She had changed. She had learned what could be sacrificed and what could not, as seasons turned. Agnes felt the years more clearly, not as regret, as awareness. She knew she could not walk forever at this pace. She also knew she would walk until she no longer could. There was no alternative plan. The frontier did not reward retreat. Hugh's illness deepened. Agnes noticed the pauses in his breathing, the effort it took him to rise from bed, the way his eyes followed her preparations with a mixture of gratitude and worry. She did not reassure him with words. She reassured him with action. Each successful journey bought them time measured in food, warmth, and reduced fear. Time enough to keep the family intact. But time, like the road, always demanded payment. And it was becoming clear that the next cost would not come from terrain, weather, or men. It would come from loss, the kind that could not be outrun, the kind that followed you home. And Agnes, who had crossed oceans, survived fire, and bent roads to her will, would soon learn that even the strongest endurance could not prevent certain endings, only carry you through them. Loss did not arrive suddenly. It arrived in increments so small they could almost be ignored. Agnes noticed the quiet first. Hugh spoke less, not because he had nothing to say, but because speech itself had become effort. Words required breath, and breath had become something he rationed carefully. When he sat longer, When he stood, he steadied himself before moving, as though the ground itself could no longer be trusted. Agnes watched without comment. She had learned long ago that naming weakness did not prevent it. Preparation did. The road did not pause for domestic changes. Merchants still came. Loads still needed to move. Hunger did not wait politely for grief to resolve itself. Agnes continued walking, continued earning, continued returning with proof that the system still held. But the center of her life shifted. Home was no longer a place of rest. It became another responsibility. She rose earlier now, balancing preparation for the road with care for the man who had once matched her stride. She moved quietly through the house, careful not to wake him when rest was possible. When she returned, dust-covered and exhausted, she went first to Hugh before tending anything else. They did not speak much during these moments. They did not need to. Their history lived in the space between words. The children sensed the change clearly. They learned to move softly, to listen for breath patterns, to step in where needed without instruction. Agnes did not praise them for this. Praise did not make the work lighter, but she saw them, and that mattered. Hugh's decline was not dramatic. There was no single night of crisis, no moment that demanded frantic action. Instead, there were many small realizations. He could no longer walk far. He could no longer lift what he once did. He tired after meals. Sleep did not restore him. The frontier offered no answers. No doctors, no treatments, no explanations. Illness here was endured, not solved. Agnes adapted her life again. She shortened some routes, chose loads that paid enough without demanding the most punishing terrain. She listened more closely to her body, not out of fear, but calculation. She needed to last. The road noticed the adjustment. It tested her differently. More mud, more delays, more moments where patience mattered more than force. Agnes met these challenges with the same steadiness that had carried her across oceans and fire. But something in her had changed. Not weakened, focused. She knew now that every journey had a limit, not measured in miles, but in time. She did not know where that limit lay, only that it existed. One evening, she returned home to find Hugh struggling to rise from his chair. She reached him before he fell. He leaned into her without embarrassment, without apology. The weight of him surprised her, not because it was heavy, but because it felt final, not permanent yet, but close enough to see clearly. That night, she did not leave again, for the first time in years. The road waited without her. She sat beside Hugh as the light faded, listening to his breathing slow, then steady. She thought of their early days, Glen Huntly, Mary Creek, the long walk into Gippsland when neither of them knew what waited. They had not built a gentle life. They had built a lasting one. Hugh's death came quietly. No struggle, no spectacle. One breath that did not return. Agnes held his hand until the stillness settled completely. She did not cry out. She did not collapse. She remained where she was, absorbing the truth as she had absorbed every other difficult reality in her life, fully, without illusion. The house felt larger afterward. Sounds echoed differently. The children moved carefully, as if noise itself might disturb something fragile. Neighbors came. Some brought food. Some offered help. Others simply stood, unsure what to say to a woman whose strength made ordinary comfort feel inadequate. Agnes accepted what was useful. She declined what was not. Grief did not stop the work. It changed its texture. She mourned in fragments, while mending harnesses, while walking familiar tracks, while sitting beside dying fires. There was no space for indulgence. There was only continuation. The road called again, not urgently, not dramatically, patiently. Agnes answered. She returned to her work altered but unbroken. Her pace slightly slower, her attention sharper, her resolve unchanged. People noticed the difference but did not speak of it. Some losses demanded silence. Her reputation did not diminish. If anything, it deepened. Men spoke of her now with something closer to respect than amazement. She was no longer a curiosity. She was a constant, someone who had survived long enough to be trusted. Agnes Buntine walked on, not because she wanted to escape grief, but because movement had always been how she carried it. The road did not console her. It did not explain anything. It simply remained, and for a woman who had learned to live without promises, that was enough. After Hugh was buried, the land did not change. The hills held their shape. The roads kept their scars. The weather arrived on its own schedule. Only the house felt different. Silence settled into it in unfamiliar ways. No longer broken by Hugh's careful movements or the low sounds of shared routine. Agnes noticed the absence most in the evenings, when work slowed and there was no one left to account for the day. She did not sit with the silence. She worked through it. Morning came early. It always had. Agnes rose before light, moving with practiced efficiency. The children were awake soon after, older now, quieter, watching her closely, as if measuring how the world would function without their father's presence anchoring it. Agnes did not give speeches. She gave direction. Tasks were assigned. Food was prepared. Animals were tended. Life resumed not because it was easy, but because stopping would have taught the wrong lesson. The road still needed her. Merchants arrived cautiously at first, unsure whether grief would slow her or end her work entirely. Agnes answered their questions the same way she answered everything else, with action. She prepared her team, checked harnesses, balanced loads, adjusted routes. When she stepped back onto the track, there was no hesitation in her stride. Walking alone felt different, not weaker, heavier. Responsibility had always been hers, but now there was no one to share even the smallest decisions. Every mistake would fall entirely on her. Every success, too. The road tested that solitude immediately. Rain arrived early in the season, swelling creeks faster than expected. Tracks softened into traps. Other drivers turned back. Agnes waited when waiting preserved safety, then crossed when the land allowed it. Patience replaced force. She had learned long ago that stubbornness killed more people than fear. Her reputation shifted again, not diminished, not elevated, clarified. Men stopped speaking of her as extraordinary and began speaking of her as inevitable. If supplies reached a place everyone else avoided, Agnes had likely been there. If a route remained open when others failed, she had probably walked it first. She did not seek this status. She accepted it, at home. The children adjusted to new rhythms. The eldest learned the weight of authority early, helping manage tasks in Agnes's absence. The younger ones learned to trust routines rather than reassurance. Agnes did not shield them from difficulty. She believed difficulty, handled correctly, made people capable. Nights on the road grew lonelier. Fires burned low. The bush spoke in its usual language. Wind through leaves. Distant animals. The slow cooling of earth after days' heat. Agnes sat with her thoughts during those hours, not indulging them, but acknowledging them. She thought of Hugh sometimes, not with longing, with recognition. They had shared a life shaped by effort rather than comfort. His absence did not undo that work. It sharpened its meaning. The road continued to take its toll. Her joints stiffened more quickly. Her recovery slowed. Agnes noticed, adjusted, and continued. She redistributed weight, shortened strides, used terrain more intelligently. Experience replaced youth without complaint. Danger still arrived unannounced. Men tested boundaries on isolated tracks. Agnes met them with the same calm authority that had always protected her. Her posture, her weapons, her reputation combined into a deterrent stronger than threat. Most chose not to learn the hard way. Fire remained a constant possibility. Smoke on the horizon still tightened something in her chest. She adjusted routes instinctively now, reading wind before it shifted, avoiding valleys that would trap heat. She had survived enough to recognize patterns. Survival bred awareness. As years passed, Agnes became part of the landscape she traveled. Children in settlements recognized her silhouette before they knew her name. Merchants measured schedules by her movements. Drivers compared themselves quietly against her example. She did not soften with age. She refined. Her temper remained sharp when tested. Her generosity, selective but real. She helped when help preserved function, pushing wagons from mud, sharing supplies when delay threatened everyone. She did not romanticize community. She understood interdependence. The road, however, never became forgiving. It took small payments constantly. A twisted ankle, a strained shoulder, nights of poor sleep. Agnes accepted them without resentment. Payment was the cost of passage. What remained was purpose. Not ambition, not legacy. Purpose measured in continuity. The children grew stronger. The house held. Supplies arrived. Hunger retreated just far enough to stay manageable. That was success by frontier standards. Agnes Buntine walked on. Alone now, but not unmoored. The road did not belong to her, but it had accepted her presence. And as long as her feet continued to find ground beneath them, she would continue to answer its call, carrying not just goods, but the weight of a life that refused to collapse simply because it stood alone. Agnes did not announce her return to the road after Hugh's death. She simply continued. That, more than anything else, unsettled people. Grief was expected to break a woman, to soften her, slow her, pull her inward. When Agnes stepped back into the familiar rhythm of preparation and departure without visible change, men took notice, not with admiration, but with recalibration. They adjusted their understanding of her. The road, however, required no adjustment. It received her the same way it always had, with indifference. Agnes's work expanded again, not because she sought it, but because others withdrew. Younger drivers burned out quickly. Older ones chose safer routes. Some left the trade altogether. The frontier aged people unevenly, and bullock driving was not a profession that forgave hesitation. Agnes filled the gaps. She accepted routes others refused, not recklessly, never recklessly, but with a clear-eyed understanding of risk. She knew which dangers were survivable and which were not. That distinction mattered. Merchants began to rely on her schedules, not dates, conditions. If Agnes says the road is passable, it's passable. If she delays, we wait. This trust did not come easily. It had been earned mile by mile, decision by decision. The road respected competence, and so did those who depended on it, at settlements. People watched her arrive without comment. They no longer stared. They moved to unload. Food reached tables. Tools reached hands. Camps held together another week. Agnes observed the relief without internalizing it. Gratitude was welcome. But it was not currency. Reliability was. The children grew into their roles. The eldest learned to manage the inn's daily function in Agnes's absence. Accounts were kept carefully, supplies monitored. The younger ones learned the geography of their world early, where water ran in dry seasons, which paths flooded first, where strangers tended to linger too long. Agnes taught by example. She did not lecture. She demonstrated. When she returned from journeys, she checked on each child individually, not with questions, but with observation. She noticed changes, adjusted expectations, corrected quietly. Her authority did not rely on volume. It relied on consistency. The road continued to test her, not with spectacle, with accumulation. Weather grew less predictable. Tracks eroded. Fires altered landscapes she had memorized over years. Familiar routes shifted just enough to become dangerous if taken for granted. Agnes never took them for granted. She relearned constantly. She walked slower when necessary. She stopped when stopping preserved control. She did not confuse momentum with progress. These were lessons learned through cost, and she paid attention to them. Men spoke of her in practical terms now. Not the woman who drove bullocks, but the driver who doesn't fail. Gender faded in the face of function. On the frontier, usefulness outranked novelty every time. There were moments when age announced itself sharply, a fall that took longer to recover from, cold mornings that bit deeper into joints, evenings when exhaustion settled earlier than it used to. Agnes did not deny these signals. She adapted. She shortened some runs, took fewer loads at once, adjusted her pace. Experience allowed her to trade speed for longevity without sacrificing reliability. The road accepted the adjustment. It always did. As long as you respected it. At night, when she camped alone. Agnes sometimes thought about how far she had come. Not in distance, but in transformation. The girl from Glasgow felt distant now, almost theoretical. Yet her endurance lived on in every decision Agnes made. Poverty had taught her efficiency. The ocean had taught her patience. The frontier had taught her judgment. These lessons did not fade. They hardened. When younger drivers asked for advice, Agnes gave it sparingly. She did not embellish. She did not encourage bravado. She told them what they needed to know, not what they wanted to hear. Some listened. Some didn't last. The frontier filtered people quickly. Agnes's reputation continued to outlive doubt. Men who had once laughed now deferred. Those who had tested her authority moved on or learned respect. Newcomers heard her name before they saw her, and when they did, the reality matched the reputation closely enough to satisfy expectation. That consistency mattered. As years passed, Agnes became something rare on the frontier. Not young, not reckless, not replaceable. She was proof that survival did not require spectacle, only persistence. The road still demanded payment, but it also offered something few people ever received: continuity. And Agnes Buntine, widow, mother, driver, constant, walked on with the quiet confidence of someone who had already paid the highest costs and chosen, deliberately, to keep moving anyway. Time did not announce itself. It settled. It settled into Agnes's joints, into the lines of her hands, into the way she rose from sleep more carefully than she once had. It settled into her voice, which carried authority now without effort. People listened not because she demanded attention, but because experience had taught them that ignoring her was expensive. Agnes was no longer the strongest person on the road. She was the most aware. Awareness had replaced youth. Judgment had replaced speed. Where others forced progress, she negotiated it. Where others rushed, she waited. The road did not punish patience. It punished arrogance. She remained attentive to small changes, a shift in wind that meant fire days before smoke appeared, a subtle softening of ground that warned of collapse beneath weight. the way animals behaved when something unseen waited ahead. Bullocks trusted her completely now. They moved when she spoke, stopped when she stopped. Their massive strength answered her restraint instinctively. Years of shared labor had shaped them into a single, functioning unit. Agnes knew that trust was not built through dominance, but consistency. The frontier around her changed. Settlements grew, then thinned. Goldfields burned bright and burned out. Roads improved in places, disappeared in others. New people arrived with new ideas, many of which failed quickly under the weight of reality. Agnes outlasted them. Her children grew into adults shaped by responsibility rather than expectation. They did not inherit comfort, but they inherited competence. They understood the land. They understood work. They understood that survival was an ongoing agreement, not a guaranteed right. Agnes watched them closely but interfered little. She had never believed in sheltering people from difficulty. She believed in preparing them to face it. There were days when her body resisted her will more openly. A knee stiff enough to slow her pace, hands that ached longer after gripping leather reins, cold mornings that took more time to shake off. Agnes listened. She did not stop. She adjusted again. Shorter strides, longer rests, careful distribution of force. She planned routes that balanced profit with sustainability. Longevity mattered now more than expansion. The road accepted the change. It always had. People still sought her out. Not for spectacle, not for novelty, for certainty. When supplies reached isolated places on time, Agnes had likely carried them. When wagons arrived intact through difficult terrain, her methods were usually behind them, even if she had not driven that particular load herself. Her influence extended beyond her presence now. Others copied her approach. Some succeeded. Most learned that imitation without understanding was dangerous. Agnes did not correct them unless asked. Experience could not be forced. It had to be earned. At home. The inn continued its quiet function. It was no longer a place of ambition, but of continuity. Travelers rested. News passed through. Agnes listened when it mattered and ignored it when it did not. She did not chase the future. She managed the present. Loss had not left her unchanged. It had made her precise. She did not waste energy on unnecessary conflict. She did not argue with people determined to fail. She conserved her strength for decisions that mattered. That economy of effort extended her usefulness far beyond what anyone had expected. The frontier noticed. Men spoke of her now with a different tone. Not awe, not curiosity, respect. They spoke of her as someone who had seen it all. Fires, floods, violence, hunger, loss, and continued anyway. Someone who did not posture or boast. Someone whose presence reassured simply because it was familiar. Agnes did not consider herself exceptional. She considered herself consistent. Consistency, she had learned, was rarer than courage. The road continued to collect its toll. Not dramatically, persistently. Small injuries accumulated. Recovery slowed. Nights grew longer. Agnes accepted these changes as part of the agreement she had made with movement itself. She would walk as long as she could, and when she could not, she would stop without regret. There was no bitterness in that understanding, only clarity. The land had given her purpose. The road had given her a life measured in function rather than promise. She had taken responsibility where others had turned away. That was enough. As the years pressed on, Agnes Buntine remained what she had always been at her core. Not a legend, not a symbol, not a curiosity, but a woman who refused to disappear quietly simply because the world expected her to. The road still stretched ahead, and as long as her feet found ground beneath them, she would continue to walk it, carrying not only goods, but the accumulated weight of a life built on endurance, judgment, and the refusal to stop moving simply because stopping was easier. Agnes did not decide to stop. Stopping arrived on its own. It came first as hesitation, not fear, but calculation. A pause before committing to routes she had once taken without thought. A longer look at the sky. A deeper consideration of ground conditions. She still walked, still drove, still delivered, but the margins had narrowed. The land had not softened. She had simply learned how thin the line had always been. Younger drivers appeared more often now. Some were strong, some were reckless, many were impatient. Agnes watched them with a mixture of detachment and quiet assessment. She recognized the way they measured themselves against her reputation, the way they sought to prove something rather than survive. She did not interfere. The frontier corrected bravado quickly. Her work shifted subtly. She accepted fewer long-haul runs, took on advisory roles without naming them as such. When merchants asked whether a route was passable, Agnes answered honestly, even when the truth cost her work. Integrity had become more valuable than income. People listened, not because she demanded authority, but because her record had outlived doubt. The road trusted her judgment, and so did those who depended on it, at home. The house felt steadier than it once had. The children, now grown, carried responsibility without being asked. They understood supply, timing, consequence. They had watched their mother manage scarcity with discipline rather than panic. That lesson stayed with them. Agnes no longer needed to explain herself. Her presence alone set the rhythm. She spent more time at the inn now, observing rather than directing. Travelers came and went. Stories changed. Names replaced names. The frontier moved forward without ceremony, absorbing and discarding people at its usual pace. Agnes listened selectively. She had learned long ago that not all information was useful. Some nights. She sat outside after dark, the air cool against her skin, listening to the familiar sounds of land settling, wind through trees, distant animals, the faint echo of movement far away. These sounds no longer demanded alertness. They felt like recognition. Her body carried the full record of her life, scars that no longer surprised her, joints that remembered every slope and misstep, muscles shaped by repetition rather than strength. She felt these things without resentment. They were evidence that she had lived actively rather than cautiously. The road had not broken her. It had shaped her. When people spoke of Agnes Buntine now, they spoke differently, not as a driver still working the hardest routes, but as someone whose judgment carried weight beyond physical ability. If Agnes says wait, we wait. If she says go, it's safe enough. That influence mattered more than mileage. She had become part of the infrastructure of survival, not visible like a road, but essential like one. There were moments, quiet and private, when Agnes considered stopping entirely, not from exhaustion alone, but from completion. She had carried goods. She had raised children. She had kept a household functioning through loss, danger, and uncertainty. What remained to prove? The answer was simple. Nothing. That realization did not frighten her. It relieved her. She began declining work openly now, without justification, chose which tasks still made sense. Let others take what they could. The frontier adjusted, as it always did. Agnes did not disappear. She receded. There was a difference. Her name still traveled the roads she no longer walked daily. Her methods shaped how others approached the work. Her influence persisted in decisions made by people who had never met her. That was enough. One morning, she woke with stiffness that did not ease. She waited, listened to her body the way she had listened to land her entire life. The message was not dramatic. It was practical. Slow down. She did. She spent the day close to home, tending what needed tending, resting when rest preserved function. There was no panic in the change, only adjustment. The land, for the first time in decades, did not demand her movement. It allowed stillness, and Agnes, who had crossed oceans, walked through fire, buried a husband, and outlasted most of those who had doubted her, accepted that permission without regret. The road was still there, but it no longer needed her to walk it every day. It had learned her lessons, and it would carry them forward long after her footsteps finally faded. The days grew quieter, not empty, just quieter. Agnes noticed the difference most in the mornings. There was no urgency pressing her upright before light, no load waiting, no calculation demanding immediate resolution. She still rose early, out of habit more than necessity, but the rhythm had changed. She moved slower now, intentionally. She drank her tea while it was still warm. She stood outside longer, letting the air settle in her lungs. She listened to the land without scanning it for threat. The bush spoke the same language it always had, but it no longer asked her to answer. People still came. Drivers stopped to ask advice. Merchants passed through, bringing news from places Agnes once knew intimately and now knew only by name. Some were surprised to find her still there, still upright, still sharp-eyed, still unmistakably present. Age had not erased her. It had clarified her. She answered questions carefully. When asked about roots, she spoke of conditions rather than confidence. When asked about profit, she spoke of cost. When asked whether a man was ready for a road, she did not flatter. She told the truth. Some accepted it. Some did not. The land handled the rest. Agnes spent more time with her hands now, not gripping reins, but repairing what could be repaired. Harnesses mended, tools sharpened, small things restored to function. She understood the value of maintenance. She had lived long enough to know that what endured longest was rarely what was new. Her children moved in and out of the house with confidence. They were not children anymore. They brought grandchildren sometimes, small, curious, unafraid of her. They watched her the way she once watched the world, closely, without interruption. Agnes did not soften for them. She did not need to. Her steadiness was enough. She told them stories sparingly, not of glory, not of conquest, of weather, of patience, of listening before acting. Stories that sounded ordinary to anyone who had not lived them. The inn continued to function as it always had, quietly. It was no longer a hub of urgency. It was a place of pause. Travelers rested. Horses drank. Conversations drifted through without clinging. Agnes liked it that way. She no longer needed to be central. She had never wanted to be. There were moments when memory arrived unexpectedly. The weight of a wagon pulling downhill, the smell of smoke thick enough to taste, the feel of leather reins worn smooth by years of use. These memories did not hurt. They settled. They reminded her that the life she had lived was not imagined. It had happened. It had been real. That knowledge carried a quiet satisfaction that did not require witnesses. Her body continued its slow negotiation with time. Some days were better than others. She rested when rest preserved clarity. She worked when work felt right. She had learned not to argue with what could not be changed. That lesson had taken a lifetime. People spoke of her now with a kind of reverence that made her uncomfortable. They used words like legend and pioneer. Agnes ignored them. She had never lived for words. She had lived for function. One afternoon, she walked a short distance along a familiar track. Not far, just far enough to feel the ground beneath her boots again. The road looked the same, scarred, uneven, honest. She stood there for a long moment, neither longing nor regret in her chest, just recognition. This road had taken everything she had offered, and it had given her a life. She turned back without hesitation. That night, as the house settled around her, Agnes lay awake listening to familiar sounds, the creak of wood, the hush of wind, the distant movement of animals. None of it demanded action anymore. For the first time, stillness felt earned. The land had not defeated her. It had simply let her go. And Agnes Buntine, who had crossed oceans, carved paths where none existed, and carried survival on her shoulders, accepted that release with the same quiet dignity that had defined every step she had ever taken. The road continued on without her footsteps, but it carried her imprint. And it always would. Agnes did not mark the day she stopped walking the long roads. There was no final journey, no last load, no moment she pointed to and named as the end. The work simply narrowed until it no longer required distance. She remained useful, just differently. People still came to her door, though now they came for judgment rather than labor. A route uncertain, a season changing early, a driver unsure whether to risk a crossing. Agnes listened, asked a few precise questions, and answered plainly. Her answers were rarely comforting. They were accurate. Accuracy saved more lives than optimism ever had. The frontier continued to move past her, carrying new faces, new ambitions, new mistakes. Agnes watched without interference. She had learned that each generation needed to pay its own tuition to the land. You could warn, you could advise, you could not substitute experience. She spent her days close to home now. The inn's routines were familiar and manageable. Supplies came and went. Animals were tended. Repairs were made before they became failures. Agnes had always believed that prevention was the most efficient form of labor. Her hands remained strong. Though slower, they still knew how to tie a knot that would hold under strain. How to judge the quality of leather by feel alone. How to sharpen a blade until it did what it was meant to do without waste. These skills did not fade. They settled into her, some afternoons. She sat outside and watched the land breathe. Clouds gathered and dispersed. Light shifted across hills. Wind moved through grass the same way it always had, indifferent to human history. Agnes found comfort in that continuity. The world had not required her to exist in order to remain whole. That truth did not diminish her life. It clarified it. She had been part of a system larger than herself. She had contributed where she could. She had endured where endurance was required. She had stepped aside when her role changed. That was enough. Visitors sometimes asked her why she had kept going for so long, why she had walked roads others abandoned, why she had risked so much when comfort was never guaranteed. Agnes never gave a single answer. Sometimes she said, because it needed doing. Sometimes she said nothing at all. The truth was not easily explained. Survival. for her, had never been dramatic. It had been habitual. Each day required action. Each action led to the next. Over time, habit became identity. She had not chased danger. She had met necessity. The children understood this better than anyone. They had watched her live without complaint or display. They had learned that strength was not loud, that endurance was not heroic, that life, at its most honest, was about managing what arrived without illusion. They carried that understanding forward. Agnes saw it in how they raised their own children, in how they worked, in how they treated setbacks, not as injustice, but as problems to be addressed. Her influence did not end with her footsteps. It continued through behavior. As seasons turned, Agnes felt her energy settle more deeply into stillness. She rested without guilt now. When her body asked for quiet, she gave it. When her mind wandered, she let it. Memory came and went without sharpness. She remembered Scotland sometimes, not as a place, but as a starting point. She remembered the ocean more vividly, the endless motion, the indifference, the lesson it had taught her about endurance without reward. She remembered Hugh most often in practical ways, a decision he would have agreed with, a method he would have respected, a silence he would have understood. Grief, long integrated, no longer demanded attention. It existed as part of the landscape of her life, present, but no longer obstructive. One evening, a storm passed close by. Thunder rolled across hills. Rain fell hard, then eased. Agnes listened from inside, the sound familiar enough to be comforting. She did not feel the old tightening of readiness. She did not calculate routes or risks. She simply listened. The storm moved on. In its wake, the land smelled clean and settled. Agnes stepped outside briefly, letting cool air wash over her. She felt no urge to follow the road beyond the rise. She turned back inside. The house creaked softly as she moved through it. These sounds had become part of her, markers of place, of continuity, of a life lived in one direction long enough to earn rest. Agnes Buntine did not fade away. She remained, present, grounded, unmistakably herself. The frontier would continue without her active participation. Roads would change, names would be forgotten, stories would be altered by retelling, but the essential truth would remain, that once, in a place that demanded more than it gave, a woman had met it on its own terms, walking, judging, enduring, until movement itself was no longer required to prove her worth. And when she finally stood still, the land accepted that too. Agnes noticed the remembering before she noticed the forgetting. It began with questions that carried more distance than curiosity. Travelers asked about roads she had not walked in years. Young drivers asked whether stories were true, whether wagons really burned and still reached their destination, whether a woman had truly crossed places men refused. Agnes listened. She answered only what mattered. Yes. Sometimes. Not the way you think. The world was beginning to turn her life into something portable. That made her uneasy. She had never lived to be remembered. She had lived to function. Memory, she knew, simplified things. It trimmed away the hesitation, the uncertainty, the long hours of calculation that made survival possible. People preferred clean stories. Agnes's life had never been clean. Still, the remembering continued. Merchants spoke her name as a reference point. Agnes would have waited. Agnes wouldn't take that route in this weather. Drivers repeated these lines as if they were rules. In a way, they were, but rules born from judgment, not bravado. Agnes did not correct them. She understood that once a life moved out of the present, it belonged partly to others. The land itself changed more visibly now. Tracks widened. Bridges appeared where once there had been crossings measured by risk. Wagons grew sturdier, roads straighter. Progress arrived unevenly, carving efficiency into places that had once demanded constant negotiation. Agnes watched without resentment. She had never believed hardship was sacred. If the road became easier, that meant fewer people would die learning its lessons. That was not loss. That was improvement. Still, she felt a quiet distance from this new world. Not bitterness. Perspective. She had walked when walking was the only option. She had decided when no guidance existed. The new roads owed something to those earlier decisions, even if no one acknowledged it explicitly. At the inn, visitors sometimes pointed to her and whispered, "That's her." Agnes pretended not to hear. She did not enjoy attention. It carried expectations she had no interest in fulfilling. She was no longer proving anything. She had finished that work. Her days remained practical. She oversaw repairs, settled disputes quietly, offered advice when asked directly. She conserved energy carefully, not out of fear, but respect for limits earned honestly. Her body reminded her daily of those limits. Stiffness lingered. Balance required attention. Fatigue arrived sooner. Agnes did not fight these things. She adjusted around them the same way she had adjusted around terrain all her life. Carefully, deliberately, without complaint. Sometimes she walked short distances along old tracks, not to test herself, but to reconnect. She recognized landmarks by feel as much as sight. The curve of ground where water collected, the tree that marked a safe turn, the slope that demanded caution even when dry. Memory lived in her body. It did not need words. People continued to tell her story with increasing confidence. Some added details she did not recognize. Others exaggerated moments she remembered as quiet decisions. Agnes accepted this without resistance. Stories changed because people needed them to mean something specific. She had never needed meaning. She had needed outcome. One afternoon, a young woman stopped at the inn. She watched Agnes closely, with a focus Agnes recognized immediately. The woman asked about driving, about roads, about how to endure when strength failed. Agnes studied her before answering. "Pay attention," she said finally. "To animals, to land, to yourself." It was not encouragement, it was instruction. The woman nodded, understanding more than words suggested. Agnes felt something unfamiliar then. Not pride, not regret, but continuity. The sense that knowledge, once hard-earned, did not vanish. It transferred. That was enough. As evening settled, Agnes sat alone and listened to the sounds of a place she had helped hold together long enough for others to inherit. The inn murmured quietly. The land breathed steadily. She did not feel finished. She felt complete. The world was remembering her now, shaping her life into story. Agnes remained uninterested in that transformation. She had lived the thing itself, and that, she knew, was rarer and more durable than any memory others might carry forward. As the years folded in on themselves, Agnes became aware of something she had never planned for. Absence. Not her own, but the absence of others. Men she had once shared camps with no longer appeared on the roads. Drivers who had tested themselves against her example were gone. Some settled, some broken, some buried without marker. Names that once moved freely through conversation now surfaced only as fragments, spoken with uncertainty. Agnes outlasted them, not because she was stronger in any single moment, but because she had learned when to stop pressing and when to continue. Longevity. she understood, was rarely about force. It was about judgment repeated consistently over time. The land reflected this truth. What had once been frontier now carried the early marks of permanence. Fences cut across plains, trees fell where roads demanded space. Towns settled into predictable rhythms. Gippsland was no longer unknown. It had been named, mapped, measured. Agnes watched this transformation without attachment. She had never believed land belonged to those who arrived last. It belonged to those who learned how to live with it. People still asked her what the old days were like. She answered carefully. She did not speak of heroism. She did not speak of conquest. She spoke of uncertainty, of long decisions made without guidance, of mistakes that cost more than money. She spoke of days when turning back meant survival and days when it meant failure. Most listeners wanted clearer stories. Agnes gave them reality instead. Some left disappointed. Others listened more closely. She no longer felt the need to ensure she was understood. Misunderstanding had never stopped her from doing what needed to be done. Her body continued its steady negotiation with time. There were mornings when standing required patience, evenings when fatigue arrived earlier than expected. Agnes adapted her days accordingly. She no longer forced productivity. She valued effectiveness. Effectiveness meant choosing what mattered. She chose conversation carefully now. She chose effort sparingly. She chose rest without guilt. These choices, once impossible, now felt earned. At the inn, children passed through who had never known a time before roads. They assumed bridges had always existed, that towns had always been connected. Agnes listened to their assumptions without correction. The world had moved on. That was the point. Progress. She understood, was not an insult to endurance. It was its outcome. Her grandchildren grew quickly. They asked questions she did not rush to answer. Some things could not be explained until they were felt. Agnes let curiosity build naturally. She believed that understanding, like strength, formed best under pressure. When she spoke to them, it was not to instruct, but to orient. Notice how things change. Don't ignore what feels wrong. Finish what you start, unless stopping keeps you alive. They absorbed these words without ceremony. They would remember them later. Agnes sensed her own time narrowing, not in fear, but clarity. The horizon of her life had drawn closer, and with it came a simplicity she had never known before. There were fewer decisions now, fewer demands, fewer unknowns. She did not miss the chaos. She had lived it thoroughly. Some nights, she dreamed, not of roads, but of stillness, of standing in open space without urgency. These dreams did not disturb her. They felt like rehearsal rather than regret. The land around her continued its slow reshaping. What once required judgment now required maintenance. What once demanded courage now demanded cooperation. Agnes approved of these changes quietly. They meant fewer lives, broken learning lessons she had already paid for. People still spoke of her as if she belonged to another time. Agnes accepted that classification. She had belonged to her time completely, and she had survived it. That, she knew, was enough. As evening settled once more over Gippsland, Agnes sat where she could see the last light fall across ground she had walked more times than she could count. She felt no pull to follow it. She had gone far enough. The shape her life left behind was not carved in stone or written in records. It existed in habits passed on, in decisions made with care, in roads chosen or avoided because someone remembered what endurance actually cost. Agnes Buntine remained where she was, present, grounded, complete, and the world, moving forward without her urgency, carried that shape quietly into whatever came next. Agnes learned, late in life, that endurance does not announce itself when it arrives. It becomes visible only in retrospect. People now spoke of the roads she had walked as if they had always been there, as if they had emerged naturally, without cost, without hesitation. Agnes listened to these conversations with mild detachment. She did not feel erased by them. She felt accurate, history. She understood, preferred outcomes to processes. It remembered bridges, not crossings, towns, not camps, names, not hands that steadied wheels on slopes where one mistake meant disappearance. She had been one of those hands. That knowledge required no recognition. Her days were shorter now. Not because time moved faster, but because she used less of it proving anything. She conserved her energy for what remained necessary. A conversation that mattered. A decision that carried consequence. A small repair that prevented a larger failure later. This economy of effort had always guided her. Now it defined her. Sometimes people arrived with notebooks, or with questions shaped by curiosity rather than need. They wanted stories that fit neatly into beginnings and endings. They wanted moments of triumph, moments of fear, moments that could be repeated easily. Agnes disappointed them. She spoke of routine, of long days without incident, of decisions that seemed insignificant until they weren't. Some listeners lost interest quickly. Others stayed. Those who stayed understood that survival was rarely dramatic. It was cumulative, built from choices made correctly more often than not. The land outside the inn continued to change subtly. Paths widened, trees thinned, noise increased where silence had once dominated. Agnes accepted these changes with the same neutrality she had always applied to weather. You adapted or you suffered. There was no third option. Her body reminded her daily that movement was no longer her primary language. She felt fatigue sooner. Balance required more attention. Agnes responded by slowing, not stopping. She had never confused speed with progress. When she walked now, it was deliberate, measured, short distances that carried familiarity rather than challenge. She recognized the land not as an obstacle, but as a companion that no longer demanded negotiation. This was new, and she accepted it. The people around her began to age differently. Younger faces replaced older ones, names shifted, accents softened or disappeared. Agnes remained, an anchor point that did not move much anymore. Some called that stagnation. Agnes called it completion. She spent time alone without loneliness. Solitude no longer felt like something to be endured. It felt like permission. She sat with her thoughts without urgency, letting them arrive and leave without interference. Memory behaved differently now. It no longer appeared as sharp images, but as textures. The feel of rains, the resistance of mud, the sound of wind before fire. These sensations existed without narrative. They did not demand interpretation. They simply were. One evening, as the light faded slowly across land she had once measured in days of travel, Agnes felt a deep stillness settle inside her. Not exhaustion, not sadness, alignment. She had lived exactly as she had been able to live. She had not withheld effort. She had not abandoned responsibility. She had not waited for permission that never came. There was nothing left unfinished that mattered. The thought surprised her with its simplicity. She slept well that night. In the days that followed, she continued her quiet routines. The inn opened and closed. Visitors came and went. Advice was given when asked. Silence was kept when appropriate. Agnes did not withdraw from the world. She simply stopped chasing it. The world continued regardless. That was its nature, And that was fine. When people spoke her name now, it traveled differently. It no longer carried urgency or instruction. It carried reference, a way to orient oneself against uncertainty. What would Agnes do? Agnes wouldn't rush this. She did not hear most of these conversations, but she would have understood them, not as tribute, as function. Her life had become a measure, not because she sought it, but because she had been consistent long enough for others to rely on that consistency. As seasons turned again, Agnes felt her energy settle further inward. She rested more, spoke less, observed without the impulse to intervene. This was not withdrawal, it was trust. Trust that the world she had helped shape could continue without her constant attention. And it did. The land remained. The roads remained. People remained. Agnes Buntine remained too, not as a figure of motion anymore, but as something rarer, a presence that had done its work fully and could now be still, without apology. Agnes began to listen to her body the way she had once listened to land, not urgently, not fearfully, attentively. There were mornings when standing took longer than it should have, when balance required intention rather than instinct. When fatigue settled in her bones without asking permission. These sensations did not alarm her. They informed her. She had spent her life responding to signals before they became disasters. This was no different. The terrain had changed, from earth and weather to muscle and breath, but the rule remained the same. Ignore nothing. Her days adjusted again. She woke later, rested when rest preserved clarity. She moved carefully, conserving energy not for distance, but for presence. Each task was chosen deliberately, each effort measured against necessity. Agnes did not mourn the loss of strength. Strength had never been her identity. Judgment had. The inn ran smoothly without her constant supervision now. Others handled what once required her attention. Agnes watched, intervening only when patterns shifted in ways that suggested future problems. She spoke rarely. When she did, people listened, not out of reverence, but trust. The land outside continued its quiet transformations. Seasons passed more gently than she remembered. Or perhaps she simply no longer rushed through them. She noticed details she had once ignored in favor of survival. The way light softened late in the day. The way sound traveled farther when she stood still. The way animals adjusted before weather changed. These observations did not demand action. They offered companionship. Agnes spent more time sitting where she could see the road without being on it. Wagons passed. Riders moved quickly. Voices carried, then faded. Life continued with the same indifference it always had. She felt no pull to follow. Her memories began to arrive differently now, not as sequences, but as impressions. A sudden awareness of heat on her back that vanished just as quickly. The sensation of weight pulling downhill. The smell of smoke mixed with wet earth. These memories did not intrude. They visited. Agnes let them come and go without attaching meaning. They were reminders of experience, not calls to return. Sometimes visitors asked whether she missed the road. Agnes considered before answering. "No," she said once, "because I finished with it." The answer surprised people. They expected longing. Agnes had never been a woman of longing. She had been a woman of necessity. When necessity ended, so did the need to move. Her children noticed the change more than anyone. They watched her rest without guilt, sit without scanning, sleep without waking at every sound. They understood that this stillness was not weakness. It was arrival. There were evenings when Agnes sat alone as the light faded, her body heavy but her mind clear. She felt a quiet gratitude, not for ease, but for completeness. She had crossed oceans. She had buried a husband. She had raised children. She had carved reliability out of chaos. What more could the land demand? Occasionally, pain flared sharply enough to remind her that time did not negotiate forever. Agnes accepted this without bitterness. Pain, like weather, passed, or it didn't. Either way, it was not personal. She adjusted. Shorter walks, longer rests, less effort wasted on things that no longer mattered. The road remained visible from where she sat. It looked smaller now, not because it had changed, but because her relationship to it had, once. It had demanded everything. Now. It asked for nothing. Agnes felt no sense of loss in that exchange, only relief. She slept more. Dreams came rarely, and when they did, they were simple. Standing in open space, listening to wind, watching light move across ground without the need to follow it. These dreams did not disturb her. They confirmed what she already knew. Her life had reached its natural still point, and she was ready to remain there. Agnes did not announce decline. There was no declaration, no surrender to the idea that something was ending. What changed was subtler than that. The days shortened not because time moved faster, but because she chose fewer things to fill them. Choice had become her final form of control. She noticed how often people mistook urgency for importance. Travelers rushed. Drivers argued over minutes. Merchants worried aloud about schedules that had never truly belonged to them. Agnes listened, unmoved. She had learned long ago that panic only made the road narrower. She no longer felt responsible for correcting others. Responsibility had shifted inward. Her body required more care now. Not medical care. There was little of that. But attention. She learned which movements exhausted her unnecessarily, which postures preserved balance, which times of day offered the clearest thinking. Morning was best. Light came gently then. Sounds were cleaner. The land felt receptive rather than demanding. Agnes liked to sit outside during those hours, wrapped against the chill, watching the world assemble itself for the day. She watched people pass. Some recognized her. Some did not. The ones who did were careful, respectful, unsure how to speak to someone whose life had outlasted their assumptions. Agnes found this uncertainty unnecessary. She was not fragile. She was complete. Her conversations grew shorter, more precise. When people asked how she was, she answered honestly. "I'm here," she said. That was enough. Memory softened further. The sharp edges of past danger dulled into something like acceptance. Even the fire she had survived, once vivid enough to tighten her chest, now appeared only as warmth without fear. She understood that memory, like land, eroded over time. What remained was not detail, but shape. The shape of endurance, the shape of patience, the shape of having stayed. Her grandchildren noticed her stillness more acutely than anyone else. They climbed onto chairs near her, watched her hands as she mended small things, listened to the rhythm of her breathing. Agnes let them. She did not tell them to be careful with her. She trusted them to learn. Sometimes they asked questions without words. Agnes answered those questions by continuing to exist, present, attentive, unhurried. She offered them an image of aging that was not fear-driven. An ending did not have to be violent to be final. The inn quieted further as years passed. Fewer travelers stopped. Roads shifted. New routes bypassed places that had once been essential. Agnes observed this with mild interest. Nothing remained central forever. That, too, was natural. She felt tired more often now. Not the exhaustion of labor, but the heaviness of completion. Agnes rested when her body asked. She slept without apology. She trusted others to manage what she once controlled tightly. This trust did not come easily. It had been earned. There were nights when she lay awake listening to familiar sounds and sensed something approaching. Not danger, not urgency, but closure. Agnes did not resist that feeling. She had resisted enough things in her life. When the time came, she wanted to meet it the same way she had met everything else. Standing still, eyes open, no illusions. She thought of Hugh occasionally in these moments, not with sadness, but recognition. They had walked their separate paths long enough. She felt no need to rush to catch up. Time would handle that. The land outside remained unchanged in its essentials. Wind moved through trees. Rain arrived and left. Light rose and fell. Agnes took comfort in this continuity. The world did not require her presence to remain whole. That knowledge freed her. One afternoon, she asked to be helped to her bed earlier than usual. The request was calm, practical. Those around her complied without question. They had learned to take her cues seriously. She slept deeply. When she woke, the light was different, softer, lower. Agnes lay still, listening. Her body felt distant, but her mind remained clear. She did not feel afraid. She felt finished. The thought did not frighten her. It settled into place. Agnes Buntine had never waited for permission to live. She would not wait for permission to stop. The road, visible in memory more than sight now, stretched on without her. She did not follow it. She had already walked far enough, and as the house settled around her, as the familiar sounds of a place she had held together for decades moved gently through the air, Agnes remained exactly as she had always been, present, grounded, unafraid of the quiet that comes when nothing more is required. The night arrived without warning, not because it was sudden, but because nothing announced it as different from the hundreds of nights that had come before. The house settled as it always did. Wood contracted softly. Wind brushed against the walls and moved on. Somewhere in the distance, an animal shifted, then fell quiet again. Agnes lay awake, not restless, not uncomfortable, simply awake. Her breathing was slower now, deeper, as if her body had already begun to loosen its grip on effort. Each breath arrived cleanly, without struggle. She noticed the spaces between them growing longer, wider, unhurried. She did not count. She listened. The sounds of the house were familiar in a way nothing else ever had been. This place had held her for years, through storms, illness, grief, and return. It had absorbed the shape of her life and adjusted itself around her presence. Now, it seemed to be listening back. Agnes's thoughts drifted without direction. Not memories in order, not reflections, just fragments. The weight of reins in her hands, the smell of dust after rain, the way oxen shifted when they sensed danger before she did. These fragments did not demand anything from her. They passed through her mind like weather across open ground. She felt no urgency to hold them. There was nothing left to secure. Her body felt distant now, as if it belonged to a place slightly removed from her awareness. Sensation dulled, not unpleasantly, but gently. The ache that had accompanied her for years faded into something neutral. Stillness arrived fully. Agnes did not think of death, She thought of completion. She had done what needed doing, not perfectly, not heroically, but consistently. That had been enough to carry her through everything the land had placed in her path. The road no longer called, not because it was gone, but because it had taken everything it needed from her. She did not answer. At some point, the difference between listening and resting disappeared. Agnes's breathing slowed further, then settled into a rhythm that felt final without feeling dramatic. There was no struggle, no sudden change, just a gradual easing, if anyone had been watching. They might have missed the moment. Agnes Buntine did not leave loudly. She never had. The house remained. The land remained. The road remained. Morning came as it always did. Light crept in softly, touching the edges of the room without urgency. Outside, the world assembled itself, birds moving, wind shifting, life continuing with its usual indifference to individual endings. Inside, Agnes lay still. Those who found her did so quietly. There was no shock, only recognition. She looked as she always had in rest, composed, untroubled, complete. Her hands lay open, no longer gripping anything, no longer holding weight. The road had released her. Word traveled slowly, not as news, but as fact. Agnes Buntine had died. People spoke her name in different ways, some with reverence, some with curiosity, some simply as part of the landscape, like a landmark that had always been there and now required adjustment. They did not exaggerate. They did not need to. Her life resisted compression into simple phrases. She was not remembered for one moment. She was remembered for duration, for staying, for returning, for not stopping when stopping would have been easier. The land did not mark her passing. It did not change course. It did not pause. But something remained in the way people moved through it, in the decisions they delayed, in the routes they chose more carefully, in the moments they remembered that survival was not about speed, but judgment. Agnes Buntine did not leave monuments behind. She left habits, and habits, once formed, outlast names. The road carried on, scarred and honest as ever, but somewhere within it, pressed into earth. Memory and method, the shape of a woman who had walked it fully remained. Not as legend, as presence, and that was enough. The days after Agnes Buntine's death did not feel empty. They felt recalibrated. People moved differently through familiar spaces, as if an unseen reference point had shifted. The inn still opened. Supplies still arrived. The road still carried wagons in both directions. But decisions paused a fraction longer than before. Conversations ended with quieter certainty. Agnes was no longer there to be consulted. And yet, she was. Her absence clarified how much of the frontier's rhythm had aligned itself around her judgment. Routes were chosen the way she would have chosen them. Departures delayed the way she would have delayed them. Risks weighed with the same practical restraint she had lived by. No one announced this change. It simply happened. At the inn, her chair remained where it always had been. No one removed it. No one sat in it either. It became a kind of boundary, not sacred, but respected. People spoke more softly near it, as if volume itself should not intrude where clarity had once lived. Her children handled arrangements without ceremony. Agnes had never wanted spectacle. They honored that. There were no speeches about greatness, no attempts to compress her life into praise that would have made her uncomfortable. What mattered was continuity. The inn would remain open. The land would remain tended. The habits would remain intact. They understood this because Agnes had taught them without instruction. People came from farther away than expected. Drivers who had crossed paths with her once. Years earlier, merchants who had trusted her with loads they could not afford to lose. Travelers who had rested briefly under her roof and carried her steadiness forward without knowing it. They did not linger. They did not dramatize. They acknowledged, then returned to their roots. That was how Agnes would have preferred it. Stories began to circulate almost immediately. Some were accurate, some were not. People spoke of distances she had walked, of fires she had passed through, of moments when she had stood alone against land that did not yield easily. Each retelling added shape, removed nuance, simplified decisions that had once been careful and quiet. Agnes could no longer correct these versions, and it did not matter. The frontier did not need a perfect record. It needed guidance. Her children noticed how often her name surfaced in practical conversation. Agnes would have waited for the ground to settle. She wouldn't trust that bridge yet. She'd take the longer way this time of year. These phrases were not expressions of nostalgia. They were tools. Her life had become a reference system. That was a kind of permanence Agnes would have understood. The land itself did not mark her passing, but the people did, without intention, without agreement, by slowing slightly, by listening more closely, by choosing caution over bravado when uncertainty pressed in. That influence mattered more than any marker ever could. New drivers arrived who had never met her. They heard her name early, not as legend, as standard. If you want to last, don't rush. If you're unsure, stop. If you're tired, rest. These were not rules written anywhere. They were habits inherited. The frontier, always indifferent to individual lives, accepted this inheritance without resistance. It had shaped Agnes. Now it was shaped, slightly, persistently, by what she left behind. At dusk, when light fell across roads she had walked for decades, wagons still moved, animals still labored, people still calculated risk the way survival demanded. But somewhere inside those calculations, Agnes's presence remained, not visible, not audible, reliable. The road did not remember her name, but it remembered her method, and that was enough to carry her forward. Long after the sound of her footsteps had faded completely from the ground she knew so well. Time did what it always did. It moved forward without pause, smoothing some edges while sharpening others. The frontier continued its quiet work of replacing people, rearranging routes, shifting priorities. New settlements grew where camps had once stood. Old tracks narrowed into memory. Wagons became fewer, heavier, faster. And still, Agnes Buntine remained, not as a person, as a measure. When arguments broke out over timing, someone would say her name, and the argument would slow. When a driver hesitated at a crossing, he would remember what she had taught without ever teaching it directly. Uncertainty is not a weakness, it is information. Merchants learned to listen to those pauses. They learned that delay was not failure, that survival often looked like restraint rather than bravery. This understanding did not come from instruction. It came from imitation. Agnes's children noticed how often strangers spoke to them as if they carried her authority by inheritance. They corrected this gently. Agnes had never believed authority transferred automatically. It was earned daily, through action and judgment. Still, they carried her influence in smaller ways, in how they spoke, in how they waited, in how they refused shortcuts that promised speed but delivered loss. The inn changed slowly. Traffic decreased as new routes pulled movement elsewhere. Some nights passed without visitors at all. The building aged quietly, settling deeper into the land that had once required constant negotiation. There was talk, eventually, of closing it. The idea was practical. The world no longer needed that pause point the way it once had. But the decision took time, not because of resistance, but respect. The inn was more than a structure. It was continuity made visible when it finally closed. It did so without ceremony. Doors shut, tools were stored. The space was left intact rather than dismantled. No one hurried the process. Agnes would have approved. People continued to tell stories. Some placed her in moments she had never experienced. Others credited her with decisions she would never have made. The truth stretched and bent to fit the needs of those telling it. But beneath the distortion, something stable remained. Agnes had not been fearless. She had not been reckless. She had not been lucky. She had been attentive. That distinction survived exaggeration. New generations of drivers inherited a road that asked less of them physically, but more of them mentally. Faster wagons meant faster mistakes. Better tools meant higher consequences for misjudgment. The land still punished arrogance. Those who lasted longest often shared the same trait. They listened. When asked where that habit came from, they rarely knew. They only knew that rushing felt wrong, that waiting felt right, that the road was not something to conquer, but something to negotiate. Agnes's influence moved quietly through these instincts. Her children aged. Her grandchildren grew into adults who spoke of her not as a story, but as a presence they had known. They remembered her hands, her silences, the way she noticed things before others did. They carried that memory forward, not loudly, not sentimentally, practically. The land absorbed all of it. Grass grew where wheels had once cut deep. Trees reclaimed spaces cleared for urgency. Paths softened into suggestion rather than instruction. The frontier continued its long transformation into something else. Agnes Buntine did not resist that transformation. She had never resisted change. She had met it, and now, long after her body had returned to the ground, that way of meeting the world persisted, not as command, not as myth, as habit, and habits, once embedded deeply enough, outlive even the names that formed them. The road did not speak of her. It simply behaved differently because of her. And that difference, small, persistent, and rarely acknowledged, was the truest marker of the life Agnes Buntine had lived. Years passed in a way that no longer kept count of her. Calendars changed. Names on maps shifted. What had once been called frontier became district, then region, then simply there. Wagons gave way to newer machines. Roads were widened, straightened, softened by engineering that reduced risk and erased some memory of danger. But not all of it. Some bends remained untouched, not because they were efficient, but because they were wiser left alone. Some routes stayed longer than necessary. Curving around land that still demanded respect, people said it was tradition. Others said it was habit. Few remembered why. In those places, Agnes Buntine still existed, not as memory, but as restraint. Drivers who had never heard her name slowed instinctively. They checked ground before committing. They waited out weather rather than challenging it. They did not know they were echoing decisions made decades earlier by a woman who had learned, through cost, when to move and when not to. The land remembered even when people did not. Records existed, of course, sparse, practical, a name in registers, a mention in shipping accounts, a line or two in local histories written long after the urgency had passed. These records were accurate in outline and empty in texture. They could not carry weight, or silence, or the feel of a road deciding whether it would let you pass. Agnes's life did not fit neatly into record. It lived elsewhere. It lived in the way people approached uncertainty, in the way elders cautioned youth without discouraging them, in the shared understanding that survival was not dramatic, but deliberate. That understanding did not belong to any one person anymore. It had become communal. The places Agnes had known most intimately changed their faces but not their character. Gippsland grew, settlements expanded, commerce stabilized, but weather still arrived without apology. Rivers still rose faster than expected. Fire still ignored intention. Those who lived longest in those places learned to behave the same way Agnes had. They watched first. They waited when needed. They acted without waste. The frontier no longer required her footsteps to teach these lessons. They were embedded now. Children grew up hearing fragments of her story without context. A woman who walked beside oxen. A widow who did not leave. A driver who never rushed. These fragments floated free of chronology and fact. That was fine. Truth had already done its work. Agnes had not sought to be remembered. She had sought to be effective. Effectiveness had carried her across oceans, through fire, beyond grief, and into a stillness she accepted without fear. It had also carried forward, outlasting her body, shaping behavior she would never see. That was legacy enough. If there had been a marker placed where she rested, it would not have been necessary. The land itself carried the imprint more faithfully than stone ever could. Roads curved where they did for reasons that predated convenience. Habits persisted where caution still mattered. Agnes Buntine did not leave behind instructions. She left behind alignment. Alignment between people and place, between effort and outcome, between knowing when to move and knowing when to stop. The world rarely paused to acknowledge that kind of contribution. It simply benefited from it. And so the road continued, changed, improved, safer in places, but still demanding judgment, still punishing arrogance, still rewarding those who listened closely enough to hear what it required. In that listening, in that pause before action, Agnes Buntine remained. Not as a voice, not as a figure, as a way of moving through the world. And long after the last story about her faded into uncertainty, that way endured, quietly guiding steps across ground that had once tested her fully and been met, without drama, by a woman who understood that survival was not about conquering the land. It was about learning how to walk with it. Long after Agnes Buntine's name stopped appearing in conversation, her influence continued to surface in quieter ways. It appeared in hesitation, in the brief pause before a driver urged animals forward, in the choice to wait out weather rather than challenge it, in the decision to turn back without shame when conditions shifted too quickly. These moments passed unnoticed by most. Yet they shaped outcomes more reliably than bold action ever had. No one attributed them to her anymore. They didn't need to. The frontier had absorbed those habits fully. What had once been learned through cost had become instinct. People behaved as though the land were something to be listened to rather than defeated. That understanding had no author now. It belonged to the place itself. The roads Agnes once walked were almost unrecognizable. Some had vanished entirely, reclaimed by grass and time. Others had been widened, straightened, improved. Where bullock teams once struggled, machines now passed with confidence. Progress erased many of the visible marks of danger, but not all of them. There were still places where movement slowed naturally, where curves remained because straightening them felt wrong, where signs warned drivers to wait, to check, to reconsider. These were not monuments. They were caution embedded into infrastructure. Agnes would have understood that kind of remembrance. People continued to tell stories about the early days, though fewer with each passing year. When they did, Agnes's story surfaced less as biography and more as pattern. A woman who outlasted, a driver who waited, a presence who did not force her way through uncertainty. Listeners nodded, recognizing something familiar without knowing why. The land carried that familiarity forward. In Gippsland, storms still came without apology. Fires still followed wind rather than plan. Rivers still rose faster than expected. Modern tools softened risk, but they did not eliminate it. Judgment remained necessary. Those who thrived longest shared the same trait Agnes had lived by. They paid attention, not loudly, not dramatically, consistently. The idea of frontier heroism changed over time. Bravery became quieter. Endurance more valued than spectacle. People stopped celebrating those who rushed ahead without preparation. They began respecting those who returned intact. That shift did not appear in records. It appeared in survival rates. Agnes's life had contributed to that shift more than any written lesson ever could. She had not argued philosophy. She had demonstrated it. If there was a final lesson to be drawn from her life, it was this: that a life does not need to be extraordinary to be lasting. It needs to be aligned with reality, with limitation, with consequence. Agnes Buntine had lived aligned. She had accepted what the land demanded. She had refused what it could not offer. She had moved when movement mattered and stopped when stopping preserved life. That balance, rare, difficult, unglamorous, was her true inheritance. When stories about her finally faded into general memory, when names blurred and details dissolved, that balance remained. It lived on in habits passed quietly from one person to another, in roads shaped by restraint, in choices made without applause. The road no longer needed her footsteps to teach its lessons. They had been learned. And so, even as time moved forward, changing faces, tools, and ambitions, the essence of Agnes Buntine's life persisted. Not as legend, not as myth, but as a steady, unspoken understanding that survival is not about how far you go, but how well you listen while you are moving, and how gracefully you stop when the journey is complete. In the end, it was not Agnes Buntine who remained. It was the way people behaved when no one was watching. Years later, when maps had been redrawn and routes renamed, travelers still hesitated at certain crossings without knowing why. Drivers still checked the sky twice before committing to long hauls. Families still prepared for lean seasons with a seriousness that felt inherited rather than taught. No plaque explained this caution. No book required it. It existed as instinct, in Gippsland and beyond. People learned, again and again, that the land rewarded attention more reliably than ambition. Machines broke, plans failed, schedules collapsed, but judgment endured. Those who lasted were not the fastest or the boldest. They were the ones who knew when enough was enough. That knowledge had no single source anymore. It had become environmental. Older residents sometimes told fragments of early stories to younger ones, though the details blurred with time. A woman who drove bullocks, a widow who kept moving, someone who never rushed the road. The fragments floated free of chronology, stripped of names and dates. What remained was guidance. Wait it out. Take the long way. Come back tomorrow. These phrases carried weight because they worked. Agnes's life had been full of such decisions, small, uncelebrated choices that added up to survival. Over time, those choices became patterns. Patterns became habits. Habits became culture. That was how endurance spread. Not through instruction, but imitation. In places where danger had once been common, people learned to slow down. In places where loss had been frequent, They learned to prepare in places where the land had once taken lives quickly. They learned to listen first. None of this was attributed to Agnes Buntine, and that was appropriate. She had never sought attribution. She had sought alignment. Her life aligned effort with reality, strength with limitation, movement with restraint. That alignment proved transferable. It survived changes in technology, economy, and population. It adapted without losing its core, even as the frontier softened into settlement. The underlying rules did not disappear. They simply became less visible. Those who ignored them still paid. Those who respected them still endured. Agnes's influence lived there, in the consequences. When historians wrote of the region, they noted progress. Roads improved. Commerce stabilized. Communities formed. These accounts were accurate, but incomplete. They did not capture the quiet discipline that made such progress survivable. That discipline had been lived, not written. Agnes Buntine had lived it fully. She had crossed an ocean without illusion. She had raised a family without guarantee. She had walked roads that did not forgive mistakes. She had accepted loss without surrender. And when her strength faded, she had stopped without bitterness. That combination, rare in any time, left a mark deeper than memory. It left a standard, not a standard of achievement, but of behavior. Pay attention, respect limits, move when it matters, stop when stopping preserves life. These were not commandments. They were observations. They held because they were true. And so, long after Agnes Buntine's name ceased to matter, long after her story blurred into background, the measure she embodied remained intact. The road still demanded judgment. The land still required humility. Life still rewarded those who listened. Agnes Buntine did not need to be remembered. She had already become part of how people survived, and that, quiet, durable, unnamed, was the truest ending her life could have reached. There comes a point in some lives when nothing more needs to be added. No final achievement, no closing gesture, no words that make the meaning clearer than it already is. Agnes Buntine's life reached that point quietly. The land moved on. People moved on. Roads changed shape and purpose. What had once required constant negotiation became routine. What had once been dangerous became manageable. And what had once demanded endurance became background. That was not erasure. That was success. Agnes had lived in a time when the land demanded more than it gave, and she had met that demand without complaint or spectacle. She had not tried to tame the frontier. She had learned how to exist within it, in. That distinction mattered more than any single act of bravery. When people spoke of the old days, they rarely meant her days exactly. They meant a feeling, a sense of uncertainty, of risk, of choices that carried weight. Agnes had lived entirely inside that feeling and had learned how to function there without losing herself. She did not leave behind teachings written in ink. She left behind behaviors written in practice. She left behind people who knew when to wait, people who understood that stopping was sometimes strength, people who did not mistake movement for progress. These lessons did not depend on her name. They depended on truth. And truth, once proven enough times, stops needing a source. Agnes Buntine's life did not end in triumph or tragedy. It ended in completion. She had given what she had. She had taken what was necessary. She had not tried to extract meaning where there was none. She had lived aligned with effort, aligned with consequence, aligned with the reality that survival was not heroic, it was disciplined. If someone were to stand now on a road she once walked, they would not see her footprints. Wind and rain erased those long ago. They would not feel her presence in any dramatic way. What they might feel, if they were paying attention, was restraint. A sense that this was not a place to rush. A sense that patience would be rewarded. A sense that the land was not hostile, but honest. That feeling did not come from nowhere. It had been learned. Agnes Buntine did not set out to teach it. She simply lived it long enough for it to take root beyond her. In that way, her life answered a question few people ever ask clearly. What is enough? Enough is not conquest. Enough is not recognition. Enough is not being remembered. Enough is leaving the world slightly more workable than you found it. Enough is not breaking under what demands strength. Enough is stopping without regret when there is nothing left to prove. Agnes Buntine reached enough. And the world, without ceremony, without pause, accepted that answer and carried it forward, embedded in roads, habits, and choices made by people who would never know her name, yet would live longer, safer, and wiser because of the way she had walked before them. That is where the story ends, not because there is nothing left to say, but because nothing more is required.